The oppressive summer heat clung to the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor like a damp velvet cloak, thick and utterly inescapable, pressing down on Lady Eleanor Street. Claire as she listlessly traced the intricate pattern of a worn tapestry depicting some forgotten, undoubtedly tedious, hunt. Sunlight, thick with dust motes dancing in languid spirals, slanted through the tall, leaded windows of the west drawing room, failing utterly to dispel the profound sense of ennui that had settled over her bones weeks ago. Outside, the manicured gardens shimmered under the relentless sun, the vibrant blooms seeming almost garish in their cheerfulness against the brooding backdrop of the dark Yorkshire moors that rolled towards the horizon, a landscape as unchanging and predictable as her own gilded existence. Eleanor sighed, a soft, utterly bored exhalation that barely disturbed the heavy air scented with beeswax, old roses wilting in a nearby vase, and the faint, ever-present aroma of damp stone. Her gown, a confection of the palest lilac silk chosen for its supposed coolness, felt like a furnace against her skin, the high neckline suddenly a prison. She longed for a breeze, a storm, anything to break the stifling monotony. The distant, rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on the gravel drive barely registered at first, just another predictable sound in the predictable rhythm of the day, perhaps old Mr. Thorne, the vicar, coming to deliver another interminable sermon on patience, a virtue Eleanor felt she possessed in frankly exhausting abundance. But then, the sound ceased, replaced by the sharp, authoritative call of a masculine voice directing stable hands, a voice utterly unfamiliar, carrying an edge of command that sliced through the drowsy atmosphere. A flicker of something, not quite interest, perhaps just surprise at the unexpected disruption, sparked briefly in Eleanor's usually placid gray eyes. Who on earth would be calling unannounced in this infernal heat? She smoothed her skirts unconsciously, a habitual gesture devoid of any real anticipation, her fingertips brushing the smooth, heated silk. The heavy oak door at the far end of the room groaned open, revealing the stiff figure of Haversham, the butler, his expression unreadable as ever, yet holding a subtle tension. "My lady," he intoned, his voice a dry whisper in the stillness, "a gentleman caller. He insists his business is most urgent and cannot wait upon your father's return from the north pastures." He paused, a slight hesitation unusual for him. "He gives his name as Captain Marcus Thorne." The name meant nothing to Eleanor. She arched a pale eyebrow, a gesture perfected through years of practiced indifference. "Captain, we expect no military personnel, Haversham. Are you certain he has not mistaken the house?" Before Haversham could formulate his doubtless impeccably polite reply, the man himself filled the doorway, effectively dismissing the butler with a mere glance. Captain Marcus Thorne was not what Eleanor had pictured. He wasn't old, like the vicar. He was tall, broad-shouldered, filling the imposing frame of the doorway with an easy, almost insolent confidence that immediately felt intrusive in the manor's sleepy formality. His coat, dark blue and impeccably tailored yet bearing the faint marks of hard travel, was open at the throat, revealing a glimpse of sun-browned skin and the stark white of his linen shirt beneath. Dust clung to his boots, fine as talcum powder. His hair, a deep, unruly brown, fell slightly over a high forehead, and his eyes. Eleanor felt an unwelcome jolt deep in her stomach. His eyes were a startling, intense blue, like chips of frozen sky, scanning the room and then locking onto her with an unnerving directness that stripped away layers of her cultivated boredom. He wasn't conventionally handsome in the soft, poetic way society favored. His features were too strong, too angular, the line of his jaw firm, a faint scar tracing a pale line near his temple. Heat, different from the suffocating warmth of the room, pricked at Eleanor's skin beneath the lilac silk. He radiated a raw vitality, a sense of life lived at a different, far less decorous tempo, that was utterly alien within Blackwood's serene, stifling walls. He moved into the room with a predator's grace, stopping a few feet before her, his gaze never wavering. "Lady Eleanor Street. Claire," he stated, his voice a deep baritone that resonated in the quiet room, not a question. It was rough-edged, lacking the polished cadence she was accustomed to. He didn't bow. Eleanor found her voice, cool and distant, a shield instantly raised. "Captain Thorne, to what do we owe this unexpected intrusion?" She deliberately emphasized, intrusion. A ghost of a smile, sharp and lacking warmth, touched his lips. "Intrusion, perhaps. Necessary, certainly. I bring news concerning your brother, Julian." The name, spoken in that rough voice, hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Julian. Her younger brother, the family's charming, reckless disappointment, vanished without a trace over a year ago after a disastrous card game and rumors of staggering deaths. Her father had forbidden his name to be spoken, declared him dead to them. The stifling room seemed to tilt slightly. The captain's intense blue eyes watched her reaction keenly, missing nothing: the slight paling of her cheeks, the minute tremor in the hand she quickly stilled on the arm of her chair. "News," she managed, her voice tighter than she intended. "What news could you possibly bring of Julian? We were informed, we understood." She trailed off, unable to voice the official fiction. Captain Thorne took another step closer. The scent of him reached her now: leather, horses, sun-warmed skin, and something else, faintly metallic, like gunpowder. It was disturbingly masculine, utterly out of place in her rose-scented prison. Understood he perished in some dockside brawl in Calais. He finished for her, his tone laced with a cynical amusement that grated. A convenient story for the ledgers and the family reputation, no doubt. The truth, Lady Eleanor, is considerably messier. And considerably more dangerous. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the thick, hot air. Julian isn't dead. He's very much alive. And he's in a great deal of trouble. Trouble that, I regret to inform you, is now very likely knocking on this very door. He glanced meaningfully towards the window, as if expecting armed men to materialize from the sun-drenched gardens. Eleanor's heart hammered against the restrictive boning of her corset, a frantic counterpoint to the oppressive stillness. Danger. At Blackwood. The concept was absurd, like a Gothic novel intruding upon her meticulously ordered reality. Yet, looking into Captain Thorne's hard, unflinching eyes, seeing the dust of urgent travel on his clothes, feeling the unsettling energy radiating from him, she couldn't dismiss it. The profound, safe boredom of her life fractured then, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar trickle of fear that slithered down her spine, colder than the Yorkshire moors in deepest winter, yet somehow, perversely, making the stifling heat of the room feel suddenly, intensely electric against her suddenly sensitized skin. The captain watched her, his gaze unnervingly direct, waiting for her response in the heavy silence that followed his ominous declaration, the dust motes swirling wildly in the sunbeam between them like tiny, agitated spirits disturbed from their slumber. The name, Julian, hung between them like a physical blow, the dust motes in the heavy sunbeam seeming to freeze momentarily in their frantic dance as Captain Thorne's stark words, alive, trouble, danger knocking, slammed into Eleanor's carefully constructed world of stifling predictability. Her carefully maintained composure, that shield of aristocratic indifference, cracked like thin ice beneath a sudden, unexpected weight. The lilac silk of her gown suddenly felt impossibly thin, the high collar of ice, as a cold dread, colder than the deepest winter stream on the moors, washed over her despite the room's oppressive heat, making her skin prickle beneath the fabric. Her brother, her charming, infuriating, vanished brother, alive. Not lost to some sordid brawl, but entangled in something dangerous enough to bring this hard-edged, unsettling man to their secluded doorstep. She found her voice, though it emerged thin and strained, lacking its usual cool detachment. Alive. But, they assured us, the solicitor, the reports. Her gaze darted past Thorne's imposing figure towards the sun-drenched windows overlooking the tranquil gardens, half expecting to see shadowy figures materializing from behind the manicured hedges, blades glinting. The serene view now seemed menacing, a painted backdrop hiding unseen threats. Thorne didn't move closer, yet his presence dominated the vast room, shrinking its familiar grandeur. He watched her reaction with those unnerving blue eyes, a predator assessing prey, missing nothing, the tremor in her hands now visibly clutching the armrests of her chair, the rapid flutter of her pulse visible at the base of her throat where the lilac silk met her pale skin, the slight parting of her lips as she struggled to draw breath against the tightening corset and the shock. "Reports can be bought, Lady Eleanor," he stated flatly, his voice low but carrying an undeniable edge of gravelly urgency that scraped against her nerves. "Are fabricated, especially by men who stand to gain from a street. Claire Eyre being conveniently declared deceased." He shifted his weight, the faint creak of his leather boots loud in the silence. Julian got in deep, deeper than even his usual impressive capacity for folly. Gambling debts were just the tip of the iceberg. He borrowed from the wrong sort. Men who don't send polite letters of demand, they send collectors. Men with knives and very short tempers. The casual brutality of his description sent another shiver through Eleanor, a stark contrast to the genteel scandals whispered about in drawing rooms. This was the brutal underbelly of the world, a world she knew existed only in lurid novels and disapproving gossip, now crashing into her sunlit prison. And these collectors, she forced out, the words tasting like ash. They know he is connected to Blackwood. To us. Thorne gave a single, grim nod. They know. And they believe, not unreasonably, that Julian squirreled away something valuable before he fled. Something belonging to them. Something he hasn't produced. They've exhausted their patience tracing his usual haunts. They're looking for leverage now. Family leverage. He paused, letting the implication hang thick in the air, scented with dust and fear and his own unsettling aroma of leather and hard travel. They'll be coming here. Likely soon. They operate fast, and the trail, thanks to Julian's predictable desperation, leads straight to Yorkshire. The image flashed in Eleanor's mind. Rough men bursting into the quiet drawing room, Haversham's dignified protest cut short, violence staining the Persian rugs. The utter violation of it, the shattering of Blackwood's centuries-old sanctuary. Her fear curdled into something sharper, colder. What did they want? Money. We have. Thorne cut her off with a harsh sound, almost a scoff. It's not just blunt coin, my lady. Though they'll doubtless take that too, happily. It's what Julian stole. A specific item. A ledger. One that details transactions far more sensitive than mere gambling IOUs. Names, dates, sums involving powerful men who prefer anonymity. Possession of it makes Julian a target, and anyone connected to him collateral. He finally took a deliberate step closer, closing the distance. Eleanor instinctively leaned back in her chair, but there was nowhere to go. His proximity was overwhelming. The heat radiating from him was different from the room's stifling warmth. It was alive, vital, charged with an intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the weathered tan of his skin, the pulse beating strongly at the base of his throat above the open collar of his shirt. The scar near his temple seemed whiter in the sunlight. "Why are you here, Captain Thorne?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze, trying to inject steel into her voice but hearing only a tremor. "What stake do you have in this mess?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through his blue eyes, perhaps annoyance, perhaps grudging respect for the direct question. "Julian saved my life once," he said simply, the roughness in his voice momentarily softening. "In Spain. Got a bullet meant for me during a rather messy retreat. Foolish bravery, typical of him. This," he gestured vaguely, encompassing the room, "the looming threat, is me squaring the debt. Trying to prevent his foolishness from getting your entire family slaughtered over a damned book." He leaned forward slightly, bracing his hands on the back of the empty chair opposite hers. The movement brought him even closer. Eleanor could see the individual dark lashes framing his intense eyes, the faint stubble shadowing his jaw. The scent of him, leather, horse, sun, sweat, and that faint, dangerous hint of gunpowder, enveloped her, strangely potent, cutting through the floral decay of the room. It was primal, unsettlingly masculine, and it sent an involuntary, treacherous warmth pooling low in her belly, a confusing counterpoint to the icy fear. "I need your help, Lady Eleanor," he stated, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. "Your father is away, you said. That complicates things, but perhaps it's also an advantage. Fewer people to protect, fewer questions for now. I need to know Julian's haunts here at Blackwood. Places he might hide something. Old playrooms, forgotten attics, ruins on the estate. Anywhere a desperate man might stash something he shouldn't have. Quickly. Before they arrive." His gaze held hers, demanding, compelling. The weight of his expectation, the immediacy of the danger he described, pressed down on her. Her mind raced, trying to push past the fog of shock and the distracting awareness of his nearness. Julian's haunts. The disused East Wing Tower, the old ice house by the lake, the folly in the woods, places she hadn't thought of in years, places redolent with childhood memories now tainted by this terrifying reality. She opened her mouth, a denial or a plea for time forming on her lips, but before she could speak, a different sound shattered the tense silence. Not the expected violence, but the sharp, clear crack of a single gunshot echoing from somewhere beyond the manicured gardens, near the edge of the dark, brooding moorland. It hung in the heavy air for a split second, a brutal exclamation point to Captain Thorne's grim warnings. His head snapped towards the sound, his body instantly coiled, every line radiating alert tension, the predator fully engaged. His hand instinctively went to his hip, where Eleanor now noticed the unmistakable bulge of a pistol holstered beneath his travel coat. He looked back at her, his blue eyes blazing with urgency, all traces of any other emotion vanished, replaced by cold, hard purpose. "Seems," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "they found us faster than I anticipated. Your choice, Lady Eleanor. Hide and pray they overlook you, or trust me and show me where Julian might have hidden that damned ledger." Now, the oppressive heat of the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a chilling vacuum as the echo of the gunshot faded, leaving only the frantic hammering of her own heart and the terrifying, electric presence of the captain demanding an immediate, life-altering decision in the suffocating silence. The sharp, echoing crack of the gunshot seemed to freeze the very dust in the air, shattering the suffocating tension in the drawing room into jagged shards of pure, icy terror that stabbed through Eleanor's chest, stealing her breath far more effectively than the corset ever could. Her gaze, wide and panicked, snapped from Captain Thorne's suddenly predatory stillness towards the tall windows, half expecting to see glass shattering inward, revealing the brutal faces of Julian's pursuers. The serene view of sun-drenched gardens and distant moors now felt like a deceptive painting masking imminent violence. Thorne moved with startling speed, a blur of dark blue coat and lethal intent, his hand already drawing the pistol she'd only just noticed from beneath his coat, the polished wood and metal gleaming dully in the thick light. He didn't look at her, his entire focus riveted on the sound's origin, his body coiled like a spring, radiating an energy that was both terrifying and perversely magnetic in the face of chaos. "Down." His command was a low, guttural rasp, cutting through her paralysis. He wasn't asking, it was an order forged in the crucible of conflict. Instinct, raw and primal, overrode aristocratic training. Eleanor didn't think. She flung herself sideways off the chair, landing hard on the thick Persian rug behind the substantial bulk of a mahogany settee, the impact jarring her bones, the lilac silk pooling around her like spilled wine. The scent of wool and dust filled her nostrils, mingling with the sharp tang of her own fear. Above her, Thorne had dropped to a crouch, his back pressed against the wall beside the window frame, pistol held steady in both hands, his head tilted slightly as he listened with an intensity that seemed to pierce the manor's thick walls. The oppressive heat was forgotten, replaced by a cold sweat that prickled across her skin beneath the silk. Silence descended again, deeper and more menacing than before, pregnant with awful anticipation. Each beat of her heart thundered in her ears, loud enough, she feared, to betray their position. Was that a muffled shout? The crunch of gravel under a boot far too close? Her mind, moments ago struggling to recall Julian's childhood hiding spots, was now a frantic whirlwind of imagined horrors, rough hands grabbing her, the cold bite of steel, the ruin of Blackwood's ancient peace. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, her fingers digging into the rug's dense pile. Thorne's voice, barely a whisper but cutting through her panic, came from above. "East Wing. Stables or the old orchard bordering the moor." He risked a fleeting glance out the window edge, his profile stark and unyielding. Single shot. Probing. Or a signal. He shifted, his boot scraping softly on the polished floorboard. The sound was deafening in the silence. His intense blue eyes flickered down to her, huddled on the floor. The earlier demand was still there, hardened now by immediate peril. "The ledger, Lady Eleanor. Now, or the next shot, won't be into the air." The stark reality of his words, the image of violence moving inexorably closer, burned away the last vestiges of her hesitation. Julian's charming irresponsibility had brought death to their doorstep. Hiding wouldn't save Blackwood, or her. Thorne, for all his unsettling rawness, was the only weapon she had. The East Wing Tower," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Julian claimed it as his pirate fortress when we were children. There's a hidden compartment behind the loose stone in the fireplace. He showed me once, swore me to secrecy." She met his gaze, seeing the calculation there, the rapid assessment. "It's accessible only from inside the tower room. The outer stairs collapsed years ago." Thorne gave a curt nod, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Good." He moved with fluid grace, abandoning his position by the window. In 2 strides he was beside her, his free hand extending down, not gently, but with imperative urgency. Up. Quickly and quietly. We go through the servants' passages. Less exposed. His hand closed around her forearm. His grip was firm, unyielding, his fingers calloused and strong, radiating heat that seared through the thin silk of her sleeve. It was the first time a man not a relative had touched her in years, and the contact was shocking in its intimacy and necessity. He hauled her to her feet with effortless strength. She stumbled against him, momentarily off balance, her body colliding with the solid wall of his chest. The feel of him, hard muscle beneath the worn fabric, the sheer physical power contained within his frame, was overwhelming. That potent scent of leather, sun, and gunpowder enveloped her completely, dizzying, primal. Her hands instinctively braced against his chest, feeling the rapid, strong beat of his heart beneath her palms, a counterpoint to her own frantic pulse. His blue eyes locked onto hers, mere inches away, intense and utterly focused, devoid now of any hint of the earlier unsettling appraisal, replaced by pure, ruthless purpose. Stay close. Do exactly as I say. No hesitation. His breath feathered warm against her cheek. For a fleeting, treacherous second, the fear receded, replaced by a confusing surge of something else entirely. A heat that had nothing to do with the summer sun, a startling awareness of his raw masculinity that tightened her stomach. Then the moment shattered as another sound echoed, closer this time, the splintering crack of wood, perhaps a distant door being forced. Thorne's expression hardened. He released her arm only to grasp her hand firmly, his fingers lacing through hers in a grip that was both possessive and protective. Move. He pulled her towards a seemingly solid paneled wall beside the massive fireplace. With a deft push on a specific carved rosette, a section swung inwards soundlessly, revealing a narrow, pitch-dark passage smelling of dust, damp stone, and decades of secrets. He didn't pause, pulling her into the stifling blackness after him, the hidden door whispering shut behind them, plunging them into an absolute, claustrophobic darkness that swallowed the world outside and the deadly threat it now held, leaving only the feel of his strong hand gripping hers and the frantic drumming of her own heart against the unforgiving cage of her corset as they were enveloped by the manor's ancient, hidden veins. The absolute, suffocating blackness of the hidden passageway pressed in on Eleanor like a physical weight, thick and velvety and utterly disorienting, amplifying every sound, the frantic, rapid quick thud of her own heart against her ribs, the harsh, controlled rasp of Captain Thorne's breathing beside her, the scuff of their feet on the uneven stone floor hidden beneath centuries. A fine, choking dust that rose with every step, tickling her nose and threatening a sneeze she desperately suppressed. His grip on her hand was an iron tether in the void, the only real point of orientation, pulling her forward with relentless urgency. She stumbled blindly, the hem of her lilac silk gown snagging on unseen irregularities in the stone, the restrictive boning of her corset suddenly an agonizing cage as she struggled to draw quiet, shallow breaths against the panic and the dust. The air hung heavy and stale, smelling of ancient mortar, dry rot, and the faint, metallic tang of long-trapped dampness, a far cry from the stifling floral decay of the drawing room, yet somehow more oppressive, more alive with forgotten secrets. Thorne moved with unnerving certainty, his steps quick and sure despite the pitch dark, his body a solid, guiding presence brushing against her shoulder, radiating heat that was both a comfort and a source of confusing disquiet in the chilling passage. Left here, his voice was the barest whisper, a vibration felt more than heard in the dense blackness, close to her ear, making her flinch. She felt him shift, his free hand brushing the rough stone wall, guiding them around a sharp corner she hadn't sensed. The passage narrowed further, forcing them closer together. Her shoulder pressed against the solid muscle of his arm, the worn fabric of his coat rough against her bare skin where the sleeve had slipped. The scent of him, leather, gunpowder, sun-warmed skin, and the sharp, clean smell of male sweat born of exertion and tension, was overwhelming in the confined space, cutting through the ancient dust, invading her senses, making her head swim. It was primal, unsettling, yet undeniably compelling, a stark reminder of the raw, vital danger just beyond the manor's walls and the equally raw, vital presence pulling her through its hidden heart. Distant, muffled sounds filtered through the thick stone, a sharp shout, indecipherable but angry, followed by the heavy thud of a door being slammed violently, the sounds distorted yet terrifyingly close, confirming Thorne's grim assessment. The intruders were inside the main house now, searching, their violence no longer a distant threat but a palpable reality echoing through Blackwood's bones. Faster, Thorn urged, his whisper taut with strain, his grip tightening almost painfully on her hand. He increased their pace, pulling her along. She tripped over an unseen rise in the floor, lurching forward. His arm instantly snaked around her waist, catching her, hauling her upright against him before she could fall. The sudden, intimate contact stole her breath. Her back pressed flush against the hard plane of his chest, his arm a solid band around her ribs, just below her breasts. She could feel the powerful beat of his heart against her spine, the heat of him enveloping her completely, the rough texture of his coat against her thin silk. His breath stirred the hair at her temple. For a suspended, heart-stopping moment, time ceased. The danger, the dust, the darkness, all receded. There was only the shocking intimacy of his hard body against hers, the strength in the arm holding her, the sheer, overwhelming maleness of him that flooded her senses, sending a jolt of pure, electric awareness through her that was utterly alien and completely undeniable. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was something hotter, more confusing, a primal recognition that both terrified and fascinated her. Then, as swiftly as he'd caught her, he set her back on her feet, his arm withdrawing, though his hand remained locked around hers, pulling her forward again, his voice a low, urgent rasp breaking the charged moment. Keep moving. Almost there. The loss of contact was abrupt, leaving her strangely bereft and profoundly shaken, the phantom heat of his touch lingering on her skin beneath the silk. What was that? How could such awareness flare in the midst of terror? Shame warred with the lingering, treacherous warmth pooling low in her belly. They moved on, the passage beginning to slope upwards slightly, the air growing marginally less stale. Eleanor focused on placing her feet, on the feel of the rough stone beneath her thin slippers, on the iron grip anchoring her, trying desperately to banish the disconcerting memory of being pressed against him. The muffled sounds of pursuit seemed to fade slightly, perhaps moving to another part of the vast house. Thorn slowed, his hand sliding from hers to brace against the wall. She heard him feel along the stone, then a soft click echoed in the confined space. A sliver of dim, grayish light appeared, widening as he pushed open another concealed panel. Cooler air washed over them, carrying the faint scent of rain and old wood. They emerged into a narrow, disused corridor high in the east wing, thick with undisturbed dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through a grimy, arched window at the far end. Cobwebs draped like ghostly lace from the heavy, dark beams overhead. Thorn swiftly pulled the panel shut behind them, sealing the passage once more. He leaned against the wall for a moment, pistol still in hand, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths, his face etched with concentration as he listened intently. Eleanor leaned against the opposite wall, trembling, her legs weak, the lilac silk now smudged with grime. The reality of their situation crashed back, the gunshot, the intruders, Julian's damning ledger. And Captain Thorn, the unsettling, vital catalyst of it all. He turned his head, his intense blue eyes scanning her face in the gloom, taking in her pallor, the smudges of dust on her cheek, the wide, frightened gray eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, only a hard assessment. The tower, he prompted, his voice low but clear now, no longer a whisper. She nodded, pushing away from the wall, forcing strength into her voice. This way. She led him down the dusty corridor, her slippers whispering on the bare wooden floorboards, past closed, forgotten doors leading to abandoned rooms filled with shrouded furniture and memories. The air grew colder as they approached a heavy, iron-bound oak door at the corridor's end. Eleanor reached for the large, rusting key hanging beside it on a bent nail, her fingers trembling slightly. She fitted it into the lock. It turned with a grating, reluctant screech that sounded appallingly loud in the silence. Thorn winced, his eyes darting back down the corridor, pistol raised and ready. She pushed the door open. A spiral stone staircase, narrow and treacherously steep, wound upwards into gloom, lit only by narrow arrow slits choked with ivy. The air here was frigid and damp, smelling of moss and neglect. Up, Thorn commanded, gesturing with the pistol. Quickly. I'll follow. Eleanor gathered her skirts, the silk whispering against the rough stone as she began the ascent, the cold air biting through the thin fabric. Thorn followed close behind, his presence a solid, watchful shadow at her back, his boots scraping softly on the worn steps, his alertness a palpable force as they climbed higher into the isolated, ancient heart of Blackwood Manor, leaving the immediate sounds of pursuit below but carrying the weight of imminent danger and the unsettling, undeniable spark of connection ignited in the darkness of the secret passage deep within the manor's forgotten veins. The tower room was a tomb of childhood ghosts and encroaching decay, freezing after the close heat of the passage and the exertion of the climb. Weak, grayish light filtered through the ivy-choked arrow slits, illuminating swirling dust motes dancing like agitated spirits above Eleanor's head. The air hung thick with the smell of damp stone, ancient dust, mildew, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from decades past. A crude wooden table, scarred and tilting, stood near the cold, gaping maw of the fireplace, the hearth piled with dead leaves blown down the chimney. A few broken stools lay scattered, and a moth-eaten tapestry depicting a faded stag hunt hung askew on one wall, its colors leached by time and neglect. It felt smaller, shabbier than Eleanor remembered, the magic of Julian's pirate kingdom utterly extinguished by neglect and the grim purpose of their search. Thorn moved past her instantly, his boots crunching on grit and fallen mortar, his gaze sweeping the room with the sharp, efficient assessment of a soldier surveying a battlefield. He went straight to the massive stone fireplace, ignoring the cold ashes, his large hands running over the rough-hewn stones surrounding the hearth, probing, testing. Eleanor stood frozen just inside the doorway, the cold seeping through her thin slippers and the grimy silk of her gown, her breath pluming faintly in the frigid air, her heart still hammering from the climb and the ever-present terror of pursuit. She watched him, this stranger who had exploded into her suffocating world, radiating danger and unsettling vitality, his broad shoulders blocking the meager light as he crouched, fingers tracing the mortar lines near the floor on the fireplace's right side. "Here," he grunted, his voice low and tight. He pressed hard against a specific stone, slightly darker than its neighbors. With a grating scrape of stone on stone, it shifted inwards, revealing a shallow, shadowed cavity behind it. Eleanor's breath caught. He'd remembered her childhood secret. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared briefly. Thorn reached into the darkness, his movements precise. His hand emerged not clutching a ledger, but holding a single, folded sheet of cheap paper, grubby at the edges. He unfolded it swiftly, his expression unreadable in the gloom as he scanned the hastily scrawled lines. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, the cold forgotten in a wave of dread. "What is it? Is it the ledger?" Thorn didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, a muscle flickering in his cheek. He turned the paper slightly, catching the weak light. His blue eyes, when he finally looked up at her, held a storm of emotions, fury, disgust, and a chilling, grim resignation. "No," he said, the word clipped, harsh. "It's not the ledger. It's a letter. From your brother." He thrust the paper towards her. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled as she took it. Julian's familiar, sprawling handwriting leapt out at her, frantic and uneven. "Ellie, if you're reading this, things are worse than bad. They're coming. Don't trust anyone. Especially not Thorn. He's not what he seems. Played me for a fool. The ledger's not here. Had to move it. Remember the place we buried the dog? Under the old yew. Look quick. They'll kill for it. Forgive me, Jay." The words blurred before her eyes. "Don't trust Thorn. Played me for a fool." The cold of the tower room seemed to seep into her marrow, colder than any Yorkshire winter. She looked up from the damning note, her gaze locking onto Captain Marcus Thorn. He stood tall now, his pistol held loosely but ready at his side, his face a hard mask in the dim light, watching her reaction with those unnervingly intense blue eyes. The raw physicality of him, the heat she'd felt radiating from him in the passage, the unsettling awareness that had sparked in the darkness, it all curdled into a sickening suspicion. Was his story about Julian saving his life a lie? Was he the danger? Had he manipulated her, used her fear and her brother's name to get her alone, to lead him straight to the ledger's last known location? Her hand trembled violently, the paper rustling like a dry leaf. He says not to trust you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with betrayal and terror. "That you played him." Thorn's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew harder, more remote. "Julian," he stated, his voice dangerously low and flat, "is a self-serving coward who would sell his own grandmother to save his skin. He stole that ledger not out of principle, but to try and blackmail his way out of debts far larger than he could ever repay. He panicked, ran, and left everyone connected to him holding the bag. Including you." He took a deliberate step towards her. Eleanor instinctively flinched back, pressing herself against the cold stone wall beside the doorway, the rough surface scraping her shoulder through the silk. The space felt suddenly claustrophobic, charged with lethal tension. The memory of his arm around her waist in the passage, the heat of his body, now felt like a violation. "Why should I believe you?" she challenged, forcing bravado she didn't feel, clutching Julian's note like a talisman against him. "He's my brother. And he's a liar." Thorne snapped, the controlled veneer cracking for an instant, revealing a flash of white-hot anger. "He owes money to men who make common cutthroats look like choir boys. Men who don't care about collateral damage. They want that ledger silenced, and they will tear this house apart, stone by stone, and everyone in it, to get it. Julian knows that. His warning." He gestured contemptuously at the paper in her hand. "It's not to protect you, Eleanor. It's to protect himself. To sow doubt, to buy time while he tries to vanish again, leaving you and your father to face the consequences." He moved closer still, invading her space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The intensity in his blue eyes was terrifying, compelling. "You think I needed you to find this tower? I could have searched this house top to bottom without you. I brought you because you are the target now. Because the only hope you have of surviving the next 24 hours is sticking with me." His words struck her like physical blows. The logic was brutal, undeniable. Why reveal himself? Why involve her at all if he were the enemy? Yet Julian's frantic warning screamed in her mind. Before she could formulate a response, a sound froze the blood in her veins. Not a distant shout this time. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing on the stone steps of the spiral staircase below them, ascending. Slow. Purposeful. Getting closer. Thorne's head snapped towards the open doorway to the stairs, his body instantly taut, every sense focused. The anger vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal focus of a predator cornered. He raised his pistol, aiming steadily at the dark opening. His other hand shot out, not roughly, but with imperative urgency, clamping over Eleanor's mouth, stifling the gasp that threatened to escape. He pulled her hard against him, spinning them both so his back was to the wall beside the doorway, shielding her body with his own, pressing her into the cold stone. His heat enveloped her again, the solid wall of his chest against her back, his arm like an iron band across her ribs just below her breasts, his hand still covering her mouth. His breath was hot and rapid against the shell of her ear. Not a sound, he breathed, the words barely audible, vibrating against her skin. She could feel the hard line of the pistol pressed against her hip where his arm held her, the frantic thud of his heart against her spine, the coiled tension in every muscle. The scent of him, leather, gunpowder, cold stone, and that raw, vital male sweat, filled her nostrils, strangely anchoring in the midst of paralyzing fear. The footsteps grew louder, heavier. One step. Pause. Another. Deliberate. Testing. Almost at the landing outside the door. Eleanor closed her eyes, her body rigid against Thorne's, her own pulse roaring in her ears, drowning out everything except the terrifyingly slow, inevitable approach of death climbing the ancient tower stairs, step by ominous step, towards the trapped quarry huddled in the crumbling stone room high above the moors, the storm of violence poised to break over them with the next creak of the door. The heavy, deliberate footsteps paused on the landing just outside the open tower door, a silence more terrifying than the approach. Eleanor could feel the rigid tension coiling through Captain Thorne's body pressed against her back, every muscle locked, his breath a hot, controlled rasp against her ear, the hand clamped over her mouth firm but not crushing, his skin rough against her lips. The cold stone wall bit into her shoulder blades, the iron band of his arm across her ribs just below her breasts was like a vice, the hard line of the pistol digging into her hip a stark reminder of the violence poised to erupt. She could smell the acrid tang of gunpowder clinging to his coat, the leather, the damp stone, and beneath it all, the heated, vital scent of him, sweat, exertion, raw adrenaline, flooding her senses, a terrifyingly intimate counterpoint to the paralyzing fear. Time stretched, thin and brittle. Dust motes hung frozen in the weak light. Somewhere far below, a faint shout echoed, muffled by distance and thick stone. Then, a low, guttural voice, thick with a rough accent Eleanor didn't recognize, spoke just beyond the doorway, chillingly close. "Empty up. Air 2, Roge. Nothin' but pigeon shit and dust. Places bleed and tomb." Another voice, slightly higher, sharper, answered, dripping with impatience. "Check proper, you lazy sod." Cap'n said thorough. "That poncy bastard street. Claire coulda squirreled it anywhere. Look behind that moth-eaten rag." Eleanor heard the shuffle of boots on the landing, the rustle as someone presumably pulled at the faded stag hunt tapestry hanging near the door. Thorne remained utterly still, a statue of lethal readiness, his gaze fixed on the doorway, his body shielding hers completely. His heartbeat was a strong, rapid drum against her spine, syncing with the frantic hammering of her own trapped beneath his arm. The scrape of fabric against stone was agonizingly loud. "Nothin'," the first voice grunted. "Told ya. Waste o' time climbin' this bleedin' icebox. Shut your gob and keep lookin'," the sharper voice snapped. "Or maybe you fancy explainin' to Silas why we came up empty. He don't take kindly to excuses. Or failures." A heavy silence followed, thick with unspoken threat. Eleanor could almost feel the thug's reluctance warring with fear of this unseen Silas. Thorne's grip on her tightened infinitesimally. She felt the subtle shift in his stance, the minute adjustment of his weight. He was preparing to move, to fight. The image of him exploding into action against two armed men in the confined space flooded her mind. The deafening roar of the pistol, the spray of blood, the brutal efficiency of close combat. It would be horrific. And she was trapped against the wall, directly in the potential line of fire. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent plea forming in her mind. "Don't. Please don't." "Fine," the first voice conceded, sullen. "But this is bollocks. Place is picked clean. Smashed up the study, the old man's bedroom, nothin'. If the little weasel hid it here, it's long gone. Maybe. The sister knows," the sharper voice mused, a cruel edge entering his tone. "Saw fancy slippers near the drawing room door. She's hidin' somewhere. Pretty little bird like that. Silas wouldn't mind if we had a chat." Persuasive like. A cold wave of pure terror, colder than the tower stones, washed over Eleanor. She felt Thorne's body tense further, a low, almost inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. The predatory stillness radiating from him intensified, becoming something feral, dangerous. Later, the first voice said, though without conviction. "Cap'n said find the book first. Priorities. But, yeah, later." Boots scuffed on stone again. "Right. Done here. Nothin'. Let's check the cellars again. Or maybe the stables. Place is bleedin' enormous." The footsteps receded, moving back down the spiral stairs, the heavy tread fading gradually until swallowed by the tower's ancient silence. Thorne didn't move immediately. He remained pressed against her, listening intently, his body still coiled like a spring, his hand still covering her mouth. Eleanor could feel the fine tremor running through him now, the aftermath of adrenaline held rigidly in check. The silence stretched, profound and ringing in her ears. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the terrible tension began to leach from his frame. His hand finally lifted from her mouth, though his arm remained locked across her ribs, pinning her to the wall. He turned his head slightly, his stubbled jaw brushing her temple, his breath still warm and rapid against her skin. "They're gone," he murmured, the words rough, scraped raw. "For now." He eased back just enough to look down at her, his face inches from hers in the gloom. His blue eyes were dark pools, intense and unreadable, searching her face, the pallor, the wide, terrified eyes, the faint red mark where his hand had pressed. The proximity was overwhelming. The heat of him, the scent of danger and exertion, the sheer physicality of his presence after the shared terror, created a dizzying intimacy. Eleanor found she couldn't look away. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling violently, not just from fear now, but from the shocking immediacy of him, the memory of his strength wrapped around her, shielding her. The conflicting emotions warred within her, the residue of terror from the intruders, threats, the lingering suspicion fueled by Julian's damning note, and beneath it all, a treacherous, unwelcome current of something else entirely, sparked in the dark passage and fanned by the desperate closeness of their hiding. He saw it, she knew he did. His gaze flickered over her parted lips, down to the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat, then back to her eyes. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He released her abruptly, stepping back as if burned, putting a foot of cold, empty space between them. The sudden absence of his heat and strength left her feeling exposed, vulnerable, strangely bereft. He turned away, holstering his pistol with a sharp, decisive movement, his back rigid. "We need to move," he stated, his voice clipped, devoid of the earlier intimacy, back to pure, hard pragmatism. "They'll regroup. Search elsewhere. But they know you're here now. And they'll be back." He strode to the fireplace, snatching Julian's crumpled note from where she'd dropped it in her fright. He scanned it again, his expression grim. The old yew tree. Where you buried the dog. Where is it? Eleanor pushed herself away from the wall, forcing her trembling legs to hold her, smoothing her ruined gown with hands that shook. The mundane question grounded her slightly. The pet cemetery, she managed, her voice hoarse. South edge of the formal gardens. Near the ha-ha wall. Thorne nodded, folding the note and tucking it into his coat. Right. That's where we go. Now. While they're distracted below, he moved to the doorway, peering cautiously down the spiral stairs, pistol drawn again. The brief, charged moment was gone, buried under the renewed urgency of survival. Yet it lingered, an electric current beneath the surface of fear and distrust, a dangerous spark ignited in the freezing tower room as the echo of the intruders' cruel threats and the captain's unsettling proximity hung heavy in the dusty air, the hunt for the deadly ledger now inextricably tied to the perilous, undeniable tension crackling between the sheltered lady and the dangerous soldier amidst the decaying grandeur of Blackwood Manor. The oppressive silence of the crypt beneath the crumbling stone chapel in the overgrown pet cemetery pressed down on Eleanor with the weight of the very earth above them, a thick, cloying darkness broken only by the frantic rhythm of her own breathing and the harsh, controlled rasp of Captain Thorne's beside her ear, his large, calloused hand still clamped firmly over her mouth, his powerful body pinning hers against the damp, icy wall of the narrow burial niche they'd squeezed into moments before Silas's men had burst into the chapel above. The scent here was ancient decay, wet earth, crumbling mortar, the ghostly memory of long-vanished animals, and beneath it all, the potent, overwhelming aroma of Thorne himself. Leather strained from their desperate flight across the moonlit gardens, gunpowder clinging stubbornly to his coat, the sharp, clean tang of male sweat born of fear and exertion, and something deeper, muskier, utterly primal that invaded her senses and made her head spin despite the terror. His chest was a solid, unyielding wall against her back, radiating a furnace-like heat that fought the crypt's penetrating chill, the rapid, strong thud of his heart a drumbeat against her spine that seemed to resonate through her own trembling frame. She could feel every hard contour of him through the thin, ruined silk of her gown, the ridge of muscle along his arm still locked across her ribs just below her breasts, the powerful line of his thigh pressed flush against hers, the buckle of his pistol belt digging into her hip. His breath, hot and ragged, feathered across the sensitive skin of her neck where her hair had come loose, sending involuntary shivers cascading down her body that had nothing to do with the cold. Distant, muffled shouts and the heavy thud of boots searching above vibrated through the stone floor, a grim reminder of the predators mere feet away. But in this suffocating intimacy of the crypt niche, the immediate world had shrunk to the feel of him, the smell of him, the terrifying, electric awareness that crackled between their tightly pressed bodies. He shifted minutely, adjusting his stance to peer through the narrow crack where the heavy stone slab covering their niche didn't quite meet the wall, his movement causing a subtle friction that sent a jolt of pure, unwelcome sensation straight through her core. She felt him tense, his focus absolute, his entire being concentrated on the sounds above, yet his proximity was an inescapable torment. The conflicting currents within her raged, the icy grip of terror at Silas's men discovering them, the chilling suspicion fueled by Julian's desperate note branding Thorne a traitor, and this bewildering, treacherous heat that pooled low in her belly, a primal response to the raw masculinity holding her captive, shielding her even as he represented potential betrayal. His hand over her mouth was firm, necessary, yet the rough pad of his thumb rested perilously close to the corner of her lip, a point of searing contact that seemed to burn through her skin. Time lost meaning. The shouts above seemed to move further away, towards the manor perhaps, leaving a ringing silence in the crypt that amplified the sound of their mingled breaths, the rustle of fabric as Eleanor tried, futilely, to ease the unbearable pressure of his arm across her ribs. He felt the movement, his head turning slightly, his stubble jaw scraping against her temple, sending another wave of shivers through her. His blue eyes, dark adapted now, found hers in the profound gloom. Inches separated their faces. She could see the faint gleam reflected in his pupils, the tension etched around his eyes, the rapid pulse beating at the base of his throat. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken peril and this undeniable, terrifying attraction. His gaze dropped to her lips, parted slightly beneath his palm, her breath hot against his skin. His own lips tightened, a muscle leaping in his jaw as if battling some internal command. The hand across her ribs tightened almost imperceptibly, pulling her fractionally closer against the hard plane of his body. A low sound, almost a groan, escaped him, swallowed instantly by the thick silence. It wasn't anger. It was frustration, desire, or raw struggle that mirrored the chaos within her own breast. His thumb moved, just a fraction, brushing the very edge of her lower lip. The touch was electric, shocking, sending a bolt of pure sensation straight to her core, melting the icy fear into liquid heat. Her breath hitched audibly against his palm. His eyes locked onto hers again, blazing now with an intensity that stole her breath entirely. The suspicion, the danger, the world above, it all receded, drowned out by the thunderous pounding of her heart and the magnetic pull of his gaze. He leaned infinitesimally closer, his breath mingling with hers. The scent of him, the heat, the sheer overwhelming maleness, was intoxicating. Her lips tingled beneath his hand, yearning for the pressure to release, yearning for something she couldn't name, something terrifying and irresistible. For one heart-stopping, suspended moment, she thought he would kiss her. Right there, in the tomb darkness, with death hunting above and betrayal whispering in her mind, she felt an answering surge within herself, a wild, reckless abandon threatening to sweep away all caution. His head dipped lower, his lips hovering so close she could feel the phantom touch. Then, a sharp, splintering crash echoed directly above them, the sound of the chapel door being kicked open with brutal force, followed by a rough shout, chillingly clear now, check down, air. Smells like fresh dirt. The spell shattered. Thorne jerked back as if scalded, his hand snapping away from her mouth, his eyes snapping towards the crack in the stone slab, instantly refocusing with lethal precision, the brief, intense vulnerability vanishing beneath the hardened mask of the soldier. The raw heat that had flooded Eleanor's veins instantly crystallized back into icy terror. He pressed a finger to his own lips in a sharp, silent command, his other hand drawing his pistol with a fluid, deadly motion, the click of the hammer cocking sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. Heavy boots clattered on the stone steps leading down into the crypt, the beam of a bullseye lantern slicing through the dusty gloom, sweeping erratically over ancient coffins and crumbling effigies. The beam passed agonizingly close to their hiding place, illuminating motes dancing like frantic insects. Eleanor pressed herself back into the cold stone, trying to make herself invisible, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear the men grunting as they moved deeper into the crypt, their lantern light bobbing. "Nothing but bones and dust," one voice grumbled, the beam sweeping near their niche again. Thorne remained absolutely still beside her, a statue of coiled violence, his pistol aimed steadily at the crack, his gaze fixed, unblinking. The scent of danger was back, thick and acrid, overlaying the damp earth and the fading, phantom heat of their shared moment. The beam lingered for a tortuous second on the stone slab concealing them. Eleanor held her breath. Then, it moved away. "Told ya," the other voice rasped. "Waste o' time. Place gives me the creeps. Let's get back. Silas'll be wantin' a report." The footsteps retreated, the lantern light receding, climbing the stairs back to the chapel. The heavy door slammed shut with finality, plunging the crypt back into near-total darkness and a silence that now throbbed with the aftermath of near discovery and the unresolved, electric tension that still hummed between the soldier and the lady, pressed together in the cold, forgotten tomb beneath the yew tree, the hunt for the ledger and the dangerous dance of suspicion and desire now inextricably bound in the suffocating darkness. The suffocating silence after the heavy crypt door slammed shut was almost more terrifying than the intruder's presence had been, a thick, velvet blackness pressing in on them, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of Eleanor's breathing and the harsh, controlled rasp of Thorne's own, his body still rigidly pressed against hers in the narrow niche, the heat radiating from him a stark, vital counterpoint to the crypt's bone-deep chill. The scent of damp earth, ancient decay, and his own potent aroma of leather, sweat, and gunpowder mingled dizzyingly in her nostrils, a heady, terrifying blend that anchored her to the present moment even as her mind reeled from the near discovery and the devastatingly intimate tension that had crackled between them just seconds before the interruption. His arm remained locked across her ribs, his hand now hovering near her shoulder rather than her mouth, but the memory of his thumb brushing her lip, the heat in his gaze, the infinitesimal lean towards her, it burned brighter in the darkness than the phantom beam of the lantern, leaving her skin hypersensitive, her body humming with a treacherous awareness that warred violently with the icy claws of fear still digging into her spine and the persistent, poisonous whisper of Julian's warning, "Don't trust Thorne. He didn't move for a long moment, his focus utterly external, listening with preternatural intensity to the fading sounds above. Muffled shouts, the crunch of gravel under boots moving away from the chapel, back towards the main house. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the coiled tension in his frame began to ease, though the predatory readiness didn't vanish entirely. He shifted, his movement causing a rough slide of his coat against her thin silk gown, his breath stirring her hair. "They're heading back to the manor," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly scrape in the absolute stillness, close to her ear, sending another involuntary shiver through her. "Likely to report. Gives us a small window." He eased back slightly, creating a sliver of space between them, though the niche was so cramped his body still shielded hers completely, his warmth a palpable barrier against the crypt's chill. Eleanor sagged against the cold stone, her legs trembling violently, her mind a chaotic whirlwind. The raw vulnerability she'd glimpsed in his eyes, the undeniable flare of desire that had mirrored her own treacherous response, felt like a betrayal of her fear, of her brother, of everything safe and predictable. Yet, the memory of his iron grip hauling her behind the settee, his body shielding hers in the tower, his sheer, unwavering presence in the face of relentless danger, it tangled with the suspicion, creating a confusing knot in her chest. The ledger, she managed, her voice sounding thin and alien in the darkness, grasping for the concrete task, the reason they were entombed in this freezing darkness. "Under the you said." "I," Thorne confirmed, his tone pragmatic again, the brief lapse into dangerous intimacy carefully walled off. He moved, turning carefully within the confined space, his shoulder brushing hers, his hand finding the edge of the heavy stone slab covering their niche. "Stay close." And silent. With a low grunt of effort, he pushed the slab aside just enough to create an opening, the grating scrape of stone on stone deafening in the enclosed space. Cooler, fresher air, smelling of rain-damp earth and crushed grass, washed over them. He slid out first, pistol drawn instantly, scanning the dim interior of the crypt revealed by the faint moonlight filtering down the stairs. Satisfied it was empty, he reached back, his hand finding hers in the gloom, his calloused fingers closing around her wrist. Quickly, he pulled her out of the niche, the sudden freedom from the crushing confinement a relief that was instantly replaced by renewed vulnerability. The crypt stretched before them, rows of ancient stone coffins and crumbling effigies spectral in the weak light. Thorne moved with silent, predatory grace towards the stairs, Eleanor stumbling slightly in his wake, her lilac gown snagging on unseen rubble. They ascended the narrow steps cautiously, Thorne pausing at the top to peer through the splintered ruin of the chapel door Silas's men had left behind. The overgrown pet cemetery lay quiet under the bruised sky, the ancient yew tree a looming, twisted shadow against the distant lights of the manor. No sign of movement. "Clear," he breathed, stepping out into the damp night air, pulling her after him. The rain had stopped, leaving the world glistening and smelling sharply of wet earth and vegetation. Thorne didn't hesitate. Keeping to the deeper shadows cast by crumbling headstones and overgrown hedges, he led her swiftly towards the massive, gnarled bulk of the ancient yew tree standing sentinel near the ha-ha wall marking the edge of the formal gardens. Its dense, evergreen canopy dripped fat, cold droplets onto them as they approached its twisted trunk, thick with centuries of growth. "Where?" Thorne demanded, his voice a low whisper, his eyes scanning the dark expanse of the cemetery and the manor beyond, watchful for any sign of returning danger. Eleanor shivered, pulling her ruined silk wrap tighter, the damp chill seeping into her bones. She circled the massive trunk, her mind casting back through years of childhood grief. She remembered a small, raw mound of earth, Julian solemnly placing a wooden marker he'd carved. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a spot near the base of the tree, partially obscured by thick, exposed roots like skeletal fingers clutching the earth. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and fallen needles. Beneath this root, Thorne holstered his pistol and dropped to his knees, heedless of the muddy ground soaking his trousers. He drew a heavy-bladed knife from his boot, its steel glinting dully in the faint moonlight. With powerful, efficient strokes, he began digging, slicing through roots, scooping away damp earth. Eleanor crouched beside him, her heart pounding, watching the hole deepen. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each handful of dirt he removed. Was the ledger there? Would it exonerate Thorne or damn him? Julian's frantic warning echoed, but so did Thorne's harsh assessment of her brother's character. The minutes stretched, filled only by the rhythmic scrape of the knife and the soft thud of displaced earth. Thorn dug deeper, his breathing slightly labored now, his shoulders straining against the fabric of his coat. Finally, the tip of his blade struck something solid, not rock, but wood. He dug more carefully now, clearing the earth away to reveal a small, crude wooden box, its surface warped and stained by years underground. He pulled it free, shaking off loose dirt. It was simple, unadorned, secured only with a rusted metal clasp. Eleanor held her breath as Thorn snapped the brittle clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of decaying cloth, lay not a ledger, but a single, sealed oilskin packet, surprisingly intact. Thorn lifted it out, his expression unreadable in the gloom. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and unfolded the oilskin. Inside lay several tightly folded sheets of expensive, watermarked paper, covered in dense, meticulous script, columns of numbers, dates, and names. Names that made Thorn's breath hiss sharply between his teeth. "Got it," he murmured, his voice thick with grim satisfaction. He scanned the top page quickly, his eyes narrowing. Names, powerful names. Julian wasn't lying about that part. This is enough to hang half the gentlemen in London. He refolded the papers carefully, tucking the oilskin packet securely inside his coat, next to his heart. He looked up at Eleanor, his blue eyes glinting in the darkness. "This changes everything. This is leverage. Dangerous leverage." Relief warred with renewed dread in Eleanor's chest. The ledger was real. Julian hadn't lied about its importance. But what about his warning against Thorn? Before she could voice the question, a sound cut through the night, not from the manor, but from the dense woods bordering the cemetery. A low, guttural cough, followed by the distinct snick of a pistol being cocked. Thorn reacted instantly. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, yanking her down behind the massive bulk of the yew tree trunk just as a muzzle flash split the darkness and a bullet thwacked into the earth inches from where they'd been kneeling, spraying mud. "Damn!" Thorn hissed, flattening himself against the trunk, pistol already in hand. They doubled back. Must have had a man watching the tree. Another shot rang out, splintering bark from the ancient yew just above their heads. Eleanor pressed herself into the cold, wet roots, terror freezing her limbs. Silas's men weren't just searching randomly anymore, they'd anticipated their move. They were waiting, trapped behind the tree, the open expanse of the cemetery behind them and armed men hidden in the woods ahead. Thorn scanned their surroundings with desperate intensity. His gaze locked onto the ha-ha wall nearby, a deep, grass-lined ditch designed to keep livestock out of the gardens without spoiling the view. "The wall," he barked, shoving the ledger deeper inside his coat. "Run for the ditch. Go. I'll cover you." He didn't wait for her agreement. He rose slightly, firing 2 rapid shots towards the muzzle flashes in the woods, the deafening reports shattering the night. "Now, Eleanor." The command, the use of her name without title, jolted her into action. She scrambled to her feet, gathering her soaked skirts, and ran, stumbling, towards the dark line of the ha-ha ditch. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. She heard Thorn curse, saw him stagger back as a shot tore through the fabric of his coat sleeve near the shoulder, a dark stain blossoming instantly in the moonlight, but he kept firing, his shots forcing their attackers to take cover. She reached the edge of the ditch and threw herself over, tumbling down the steep, grassy slope into the cold, muddy water pooled at the bottom, gasping as the icy shock hit her. She scrambled deeper into the ditch's shadow, pressing herself against the muddy bank, heart hammering against her ribs. Above, the furious exchange of gunfire continued, Thorn's measured shots answered by the sharper cracks of at least 2 other pistols from the woods. She heard a cry of pain from the trees, then Thorn was suddenly beside her, sliding down the muddy slope, landing heavily in the water beside her. He was breathing hard, his face pale beneath the dirt and stubble, his left hand clamped over the dark stain spreading on his right sleeve. "One down," he gritted out, pain tightening his voice. "At least one more out there." He peered cautiously over the lip of the ditch. "Can't stay here. They'll flank us." He looked at her, his blue eyes fierce in the gloom. "The woods. We lose them in the trees. Or we die here." He pushed himself up, offering his uninjured arm. "Can you run?" Eleanor looked at the blood soaking his sleeve, at the grim determination on his face, at the dark woods looming beyond the ditch. Fear screamed at her to freeze, to hide. But Julian's ledger was inside Thorn's coat. Her only hope lay with this wounded, dangerous man who might be her betrayer or her only protector. She met his gaze, the conflicting currents within her, terror, suspicion, and the treacherous, undeniable pull, coalescing into a single, desperate resolve. She grasped his offered arm, her fingers cold and muddy against his skin. "I can run," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The gunfire had paused, replaced by the tense, watchful silence of hunters regrouping. Thorn nodded, a flicker of something like approval in his eyes. "Then run like hell." He hauled her up, and together, dripping mud and blood, they scrambled up the opposite bank of the ditch and plunged headlong into the pitch-black, tangled embrace of the ancient woods bordering Blackwood Manor, the hunters close behind, the deadly ledger of burning weight against Thorn's chest, and the storm of violence and unresolved desire howling at their heels as they vanished into the suffocating darkness beneath the canopy. The wood swallowed them whole, a suffocating tangle of ancient oaks and grasping undergrowth that clawed at Eleanor's soaked silk skirts and scratched her exposed skin as she stumbled blindly after Thorn, his grip on her wrist an iron tether in the oppressive darkness beneath the dense canopy where the bruised moonlight barely penetrated, filtering down in fractured, ghostly slivers that did little to illuminate the treacherous ground snaking with roots and hidden dips. The air hung thick and damp, smelling of wet earth, decaying leaves, pine resin, and the sharp, coppery tang of Thorn's blood soaking through the makeshift pressure he kept clamped on his wounded arm. A dark stain blooming steadily against the already ruined fabric of his coat sleeve, its scent mingling nauseatingly with the primal aroma of fierce sweat and damp wool that clung to them both. Behind them, crashing through the undergrowth and sharp, guttural curses confirmed at least one pursuer was still doggedly following their frantic trail, the sounds terrifyingly close, snapping twigs and rustling foliage echoing like death knells in the humid night air. Thorn moved with a predator's desperate grace despite the injury, pulling her relentlessly forward, his breathing ragged but controlled, his head constantly swiveling, scanning the impenetrable gloom for threats or sanctuary, the pistol held ready in his good hand a stark silhouette against the deeper blackness. "Faster, Eleanor," he rasped, his voice tight with pain and urgency, hauling her over a moss-slick fallen log, her foot slipping in the mud, almost wrenching her arm from its socket before his unyielding grip kept her upright, propelling her onward. The icy water from the ditch had long since leached any residual warmth from her bones, replaced by a bone-deep chill that made her teeth chatter, the ruined lilac gown plastered to her skin like a second, freezing shroud, every stumble, every tearing branch of fresh agony against her exhaustion and terror. They splashed through a shallow, ice-cold stream, the shock jolting a gasp from her lips, the water swirling darkly around their knees before Thorn dragged her up the opposite bank, the mud sucking greedily at their boots. He paused for a fraction of a second, listening intently, his body coiled, head tilted. The crashing pursuit seemed momentarily confused by the water, the curses fading slightly as their hunter paused upstream. "This way," Thorn breathed, veering sharply left, deeper into a denser thicket of holly and thorny brambles that tore viciously at her arms and legs, the sacrifice of flesh for cover. He pushed through a final curtain of wet ferns, and suddenly, the ground dipped into a small, hidden hollow, barely visible in the gloom. Nestled against a rocky outcrop, half collapsed and choked with ivy, stood the sagging remnants of what looked like an old gamekeeper's hut, its timber walls bowed, the thatch roof mostly caved in, a single window gaping like a dark, sightless eye. "In there," Thorn ordered, shoving her towards the dark maw of the doorway, its rotten door hanging askew on one hinge. He followed her inside, spinning instantly to face the entrance, pistol raised, his back pressed against the rough timber wall beside the opening, listening with every fiber of his being while Eleanor collapsed against the far wall, gasping, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold, exertion, and shock, the rough wood scraping her back through the thin silk. The hut's interior was a tomb of decay and neglect, smelling overpoweringly of damp rot, mold, and animal musk. Moonlight filtered weakly through the ruined roof and the open window, illuminating swirling dust motes and the skeletal remains of crude furniture. Thorn remained frozen at the entrance for agonizing minutes, his silhouette stark and tense against the dim rectangle of the doorway, his injured arm held stiffly against his body, the dark stain spreading relentlessly down his sleeve, dripping onto the earth and floor with soft, rhythmic plinks that sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded, moving further away downstream, the crashing and curses swallowed by the vast, indifferent murmur of the woods. Thorn finally sagged slightly, a low groan escaping his clenched teeth as the immediate adrenaline surge ebbed, leaving raw pain etched deep into the lines of his face. He slowly lowered the pistol, his breathing harsh and uneven. Lost them, for now, he managed, his voice rough with exhaustion. He turned, his movements stiff, his gaze finding her huddled in the shadows. The fierce intensity was still there, but underscored now by profound weariness and the stark reality of his wound. Need to see to this. He gestured vaguely at his arm, his face pale beneath the grime and stubble in the weak light. Eleanor pushed herself away from the wall, forcing her trembling legs to hold her. The suspicion, the terror, the confusing heat, it all warred within her, but the sight of his blood, the undeniable reality of his injury sustained protecting her, tipped the scales towards necessity. "Let me help," she said, her voice barely a whisper, stepping closer, her sodden gown whispering against the dirt floor. He didn't argue, just nodded curtly, leaning his back against the wall and slowly, painfully, shrugging out of his heavy, blood-soaked coat, letting it slump to the ground with a wet thud. The ledger, wrapped in oilskin, protruded slightly from an inside pocket. He wore only a sweat-dampened linen shirt beneath, plastered to the powerful planes of his chest and back. The bullet had torn through the thick wool of his coat sleeve and the shirt beneath, leaving a ragged, dark hole high on his right bicep, blood welling steadily. Eleanor swallowed hard, fighting a wave of dizziness. She'd never tended a wound before, only seen the neat bandages applied by maids to scraped knees. This was raw, violent, terrifying. I need light," she stammered, looking around the derelict hut desperately. Thorne fumbled in a pocket of his discarded coat, pulling out a small tinderbox. With shaking, blood-slicked fingers, he managed to strike a spark onto a dried piece of charcloth he found in the box, then carefully transferred it to a small pile of dry moss and twigs he scraped together in a relatively dry corner. A tiny, fragile flame flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the crumbling walls, illuminating the grim reality of his injury and the stark intimacy of their isolation. In the flickering light, Eleanor could see the wound clearly now, an ugly furrow torn through the muscle, deep but thankfully not, it seemed, hitting bone. Blood oozed thickly. She ripped a long strip from the already ruined hem of her silk petticoat, the tearing sound loud in the stillness. Kneeling beside him, her sodden skirts pooling around her, she hesitated for only a second before pressing the folded silk firmly against the bleeding gash. Thorne hissed sharply through his teeth, his body tensing, his head snapping back against the wall, his jaw clenched, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the chill. "I'm sorry," she whispered, applying steady pressure, feeling the heat of his skin, the solid muscle beneath her fingers, the rapid, strong pulse beating against her palm. His eyes, dark and intense in the firelight, locked onto hers. The proximity was overwhelming. She was kneeling between his legs, her body close to his, her hands on his bare arm, the flickering light playing over the hard lines of his face, the vulnerability of his pain stripping away some of the soldier's harshness. The scent of him, blood, sweat, damp earth, and that underlying, potent masculinity, filled the small space, mingling with the wood smoke. His free hand, resting on his thigh, clenched into a fist, the knuckles white. She could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest, feel the tension thrumming through him, a different tension now, layered over the pain. Her own breath caught, her pulse fluttering wildly like a trapped bird against her ribs. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a silent, burning question hanging in the charged air between them. The world outside, the hunters, the ledger, Julian's betrayal, Silas's threat, ceased to exist. There was only the crackle of the tiny fire, the drumming of the rain starting again on the ruined roof, the feel of his hot skin beneath her fingers, and the magnetic pull of his blue eyes drawing her inexorably closer. She felt an answering heat bloom within her, fierce and undeniable, washing away the last vestiges of cold. Her hand, still pressing the makeshift bandage, trembled. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in. He didn't move away. His uninjured hand lifted, his calloused fingers brushing a stray, damp lock of hair from her cheek, the touch sending an electric jolt through her entire body. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, rough skin against her softness, his gaze never leaving hers, dark with a hunger that mirrored her own. His head dipped lower, his breath warm against her lips. The space between them vanished. His mouth captured hers with a sudden, fierce urgency that stole her breath. It wasn't gentle. It was raw, demanding, a claiming born of shared terror. Desperate survival, and the explosive attraction that had simmered between them since the moment he filled her drawing room doorway. Heat, intense and shocking, exploded through her, melting the last remnants of fear and suspicion into molten desire. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in the damp hair at his nape, pressing closer, the silk bandage forgotten, lost in the taste of him, salt, blood, rain, and something uniquely, powerfully Thorn. The tiny fire cast their entwined shadows large and frantic against the crumbling wall of the abandoned hut as the storm lashed the woods outside, the world beyond their desperate, stolen moment forgotten in the consuming heat of their collision, the wounded soldier and the sheltered lady finding reckless, dangerous solace in each other's arms amidst the decay and the downpour, the deadly ledger of forgotten weight on the blood-stained coat beside them. The kiss deepened, a desperate, wordless communication of all the fear, the tension, the unspoken need that had built between them through gunfire and crypts and freezing ditches. His good arm wrapped around her waist, hauling her fully against him, her body molding to the hard planes of his chest and thighs despite the layers of soaked fabric, the pain in his arm momentarily eclipsed by the overwhelming urgency of the connection. Her fingers traced the strong column of his neck, the roughness of his stubble scraping her palm, the heat of his skin beneath her touch intoxicating. He groaned against her mouth, a low, visceral sound that vibrated through her, his hand sliding down her back, pressing her even closer, igniting trails of fire wherever he touched. The rain drummed harder on the sagging roof, a frantic counterpoint to the pounding of their hearts. A loose shutter banged violently against the outside wall with a gust of wind, the sudden noise a harsh intrusion into their fevered embrace. Thorn broke the kiss abruptly, his head snapping up, his body instantly rigid, the soldier's alertness slamming back into place. He listened, his breath coming in harsh gasps, his eyes scanning the dark doorway and window, the raw desire in his gaze warring with the ingrained vigilance. Eleanor remained pressed against him, trembling, her lips swollen, her body humming with the aftershocks, reality crashing back with the icy chill of the hut and the relentless drumming of the rain. The moment hung suspended, fragile and charged, the heat of their kiss still burning on their lips, the danger outside the crumbling walls a stark reminder that their desperate sanctuary was temporary, the hunters still prowling the storm-lashed woods, drawn by the scent of blood and the incriminating weight of the ledger lying discarded on the damp earth floor beside Thorn's bloodied coat. His eyes met hers again in the flickering firelight, dark and unreadable now, filled with a turbulent mix of lingering heat, grim resolve, and the ever-present shadow of the peril that stalked them just beyond the circle of frail light, the fragile truce of desire shattered by the relentless demands of survival. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any words could form, a new sound cut through the storm's fury, the sharp, excited baying of hounds, distant but unmistakable, carried on the wind. Silas wasn't just sending men anymore. He was sending trackers. The fragile sanctuary of the hut evaporated like smoke. Thorn's expression hardened into granite, the brief vulnerability vanishing. Damn it to hell, he swore, pushing himself away from the wall with a grimace of pain, his gaze locking onto the doorway where the first gray light of a stormy dawn was beginning to dilute the absolute blackness, the baying hounds drawing inexorably closer, a chilling promise that the chase was far from over. The frantic baying of the hounds sliced through the drumming rain and the howling wind, a sound as primal and chilling as the crack of gunfire, shredding the fragile, heat-tinged aftermath of their kiss and slamming Thorn back into the brutal reality of their predicament. The sound wasn't distant speculation. It was close, terrifyingly close, cutting through the woods like a knife, converging on the hidden hollow with horrifying speed. Silas wasn't playing games anymore. He'd unleashed the ultimate trackers, drawn by the scent of blood, Thorn's blood, saturating the muddy trail they'd left from ditch to thicket to this crumbling sanctuary. Thorn's face, moments ago softened by desire and pain, hardened into a mask of ferocious resolve, all vulnerability extinguished by the immediate, snarling threat. He shoved himself upright with a stifled groan, ignoring the fresh wave of agony that washed over him as the movement jarred his wounded arm, the crude silk bandage Eleanor had applied already soaked through with crimson. His eyes, blue chips of ice in the firelight, scanned the derelict hut, the sagging walls, the gaping window, the single precarious door. "No time," he rasped, his voice raw. "They'll be on us in minutes." He snatched up his blood-soaked coat, fumbling inside for a moment before his hand closed around the oilskin packet containing the ledger. He shoved it deep into an inner pocket of his waistcoat, then grabbed Eleanor's arm, his grip bruising in its urgency. "Move. Out the back." He didn't wait, hauling her towards the rear of the hut where the rotten timber wall had partially collapsed inward, creating a jagged opening choked with wet ivy and splintered wood. He kicked aside a broken stool, shoved through the tangled vegetation, dragging Eleanor after him into the lashing rain and the deeper, more treacherous woods beyond the hollow. The storm had intensified. Rain fell in blinding, icy sheets, driven sideways by a gale that tore at their clothes and stung their faces, turning the forest floor into a churning morass of mud and slick leaves. The baying grew louder, more frenzied, accompanied now by the unmistakable shouts of men urging the hounds on, their voices carrying clearly on the wind. They were coming from the direction of the ditch, cutting off their retreat towards the manor. Thorn veered sharply uphill, away from the sounds, pulling Eleanor relentlessly through a nightmare landscape of grasping branches and hidden sinkholes. Every step sent fresh jolts of pain through his arm, his breathing becoming increasingly labored, his face etched with strain beneath the grime and rainwater. Eleanor stumbled beside him, her lungs burning, her soaked gown a leaden weight dragging her down, the cold penetrating to her very bones, but terror lent her legs a desperate strength. The hounds sounded terrifyingly close behind them now, their excited yelps turning into deep, guttural barks as they caught the strong scent trail. Thorn suddenly stopped, pulling her down behind the massive, moss-covered trunk of a fallen beech tree. He peered over the rotting wood, pistol drawn, his jaw clenched. Through the driving rain, Eleanor could just make out the flicker of lantern light bobbing through the trees below, maybe 50 yards away, and the dark, leaping shapes of at least 3 large hounds straining at leashes held by shadowy figures. Too many, Thorn muttered, his voice tight with pain and frustration. Can't outrun the dogs. Not like this. His eyes darted around their meager cover, the fallen tree, a cluster of dense holly bushes. Hopeless. He looked at Eleanor, rainwater streaming down his face, his blue eyes holding a terrifying mix of determination and something akin to despair. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and urgent, cutting through the storm and the nearing hounds. If they take me, you run. Don't look back. Head for the village. Find the magistrate, Henderson. Tell him everything. Show him Julian's note if you have to. The ledger, he patted his waistcoat pocket, is the only thing that might save you now. Use it. The starkness of his words, the implication that capture meant death for him, sent a fresh wave of icy dread through her, colder than the rain. Before she could protest, before she could even process the horrifying sacrifice he seemed ready to make, a new sound erupted from the darkness ahead and to their left. Not hounds, but the sharp, rhythmic clop 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 of multiple horses moving at speed, accompanied by the jingle of harnesses and the unmistakable, authoritative shout of a man's voice. Spread out. Check that thicket. Look for tracks. Thorn's head snapped towards the new sound, his eyes widening slightly in surprise, then narrowing in renewed calculation. Riders. He breathed, confusion warring with the soldier's instinctive assessment. Not Silas's lot. The lantern light below wavered, the shouts of Silas's men turning from eager pursuit to alarmed confusion as the sound of approaching horsemen grew louder, closer. The baying hounds faltered, their handlers clearly hesitating. Thorn seized the moment. Come on, he hissed, pulling Eleanor up. He didn't head away from the new arrivals, but angled towards them, moving parallel to the unseen riders but staying low, using the terrain and the storm for cover. They scrambled up a steep, muddy bank, slipping and sliding, Thorn using his good arm to haul her up when she fell. Cresting the rise, they found themselves on the edge of a wider, muddy forest track. And there, illuminated by the swinging lanterns of their own party, were at least a dozen mounted men. They weren't ruffians, they wore the dark, practical coats and tricorn hats of a local militia or perhaps gamekeepers. At their head, astride a powerful bay gelding, sat a broad-shouldered man with a stern, weathered face partially obscured by the rain dripping from his hat brim. He was shouting orders, directing men into the woods on either side of the track. Fan out. Secure the perimeter. Look for intruders or anyone in distress. And find the source of that damned gunfire earlier. Thorn recognized the voice, the bearing. Henderson, he breathed, a flicker of grim hope in his eyes. The magistrate. He didn't hesitate. Stepping out from the cover of the trees onto the track, directly into the path of the mounted party, Thorn raised his uninjured arm, his voice cutting through the rain with surprising force despite his obvious pain and exhaustion. Magistrate Henderson. Hold. The reaction was instantaneous. Lantern beams swung towards them, blinding in the downpour. Horses snorted and shied. A dozen pistols and fowling pieces snapped up, aimed directly at the two bedraggled, mud-splattered figures emerging from the storm-racked woods. Eleanor flinched, shrinking back instinctively against Thorn, the sudden focus of so many armed men terrifying after the shadowy pursuit. The magistrate reined in his horse sharply, his keen eyes raking over them, Thorn's blood-soaked sleeve, his drawn pistol held loosely but visibly, Eleanor's torn, soaked finery, her face pale and terrified beneath the mud and rainwater. "Identify yourselves," Henderson commanded, his voice hard, suspicious. "State your business here, and explain the gunfire." Thorn kept his pistol pointed at the ground but didn't lower it. "Captain Marcus Thorn, late of His Majesty's 33rd Foot," he stated, his voice rough but clear. "And this is Lady Eleanor Street. Clare of Blackwood Manor. We are fleeing armed intruders who attacked the manor tonight, seeking refuge and to report a grievous crime." He gestured back towards the woods where Silas's men and the hounds had been moments before, though the sounds had now vanished, likely retreating at the sight of the militia. "Those men are still out there, magistrate. Cutthroats in the employ of a man called Silas. They shot me, and they intend murder to recover stolen property." Henderson's stern gaze flickered from Thorn's wound to Eleanor's terrified face. "Lady Eleanor, is this true?" Eleanor found her voice, trembling but desperate. "It is, sir. They broke into Blackwood. They were searching for something, threatening." Captain Thorn intervened. "They shot him as we fled." She pointed a shaking hand back towards the woods. "They had hounds. They were right behind us." The magistrate's expression remained unreadable, but he signaled sharply to his men. "Jenkins, take 3 men and scout that area back there. Look for signs of trespassers, dogs, anything. Be sharp." He looked back at Thorn and Eleanor, his gaze lingering on Thorn's bleeding arm. "You're wounded, Captain. Badly, by the look of it. And Lady Eleanor appears in shock. My lodge is half a mile north. You'll come with us." Now, it wasn't a request. Thorn hesitated, his eyes meeting Henderson's. Sanctuary. Or a different kind of trap. He had the ledger, the names that might implicate powerful men, perhaps even men known to the magistrate. Could he trust Henderson? But Eleanor was shivering violently, her strength clearly failing, and his own wound was sapping his reserves. The immediate threat of Silas was held at bay, for now, by the militia's presence. He slowly lowered his pistol, holstering it with a stiff movement. "We accept your offer of shelter, magistrate," Thorn said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "And we have urgent information regarding the safety of Lady Eleanor's family in this county." Henderson nodded curtly. "Mount up, Carter. Give the lady your horse. Williams, you support the captain." As a militiaman dismounted and helped the near-fainting Eleanor onto his saddle, and another moved to Thorn's side to offer support, the captain's gaze swept the dark, rain-lashed woods one last time. The immediate hunters had retreated, swallowed by the storm and the unexpected force. But the ledger was a burning weight against his ribs, Julian's treachery a festering wound, and the kiss in the crumbling hut a searing brand on his memory. The danger hadn't passed, it had merely changed shape. As they turned onto the muddy track towards the magistrate's lodge, the militia forming a protective cordon around them, Thorn knew the fragile respite was just that, a pause in the storm, not its end. Silas wouldn't give up. The names in the ledger demanded silence. And the unsettling, undeniable connection forged in blood and desperation between the wounded soldier and the disgraced lady now rode with them into an uncertain sanctuary, the game far from over, the next move hanging precariously in the rain-swept darkness. The comparative warmth of Magistrate Henderson's hunting lodge hit Eleanor like a physical blow after the hours of freezing rain and terror, a thick, smoky heat radiating from a roaring fire in the massive stone hearth that seemed almost painfully bright after the storm-lashed woods. Yet the warmth couldn't penetrate the icy dread that had settled deep within her bones, nor the profound exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. She stood dripping just inside the doorway, shivering violently despite the heat, her ruined lilac gown clinging like a shroud, plastered with mud and torn in a dozen places, her hair a tangled, wet mass around her pale, scratched face. Thorn stood beside her, swaying slightly, his face ashen beneath the grime and stubble, his breathing shallow and ragged, the dark stain on his right sleeve now a vast, glistening patch spreading down to his elbow, dripping crimson onto the worn flagstones. The militia men who had escorted them crowded the small entrance hall, steaming in their wet coats, filling the space with the smell of damp wool, horses, and the metallic tang of Thorn's blood. Henderson, shedding his own dripping greatcoat with brisk efficiency, barked orders. Simmons, stoke that fire higher. Mrs. Bellamy, hot water, bandages, your sharpest scissors and needle, and brandy, the good French stuff. Quickly now. Williams, Carter, help the captain to that settle by the fire. Gently, man, gently. He's lost enough blood. Two burly militiamen moved to support Thorne as he stumbled forward, a low groan escaping his clenched teeth as the movement jarred his arm. Eleanor instinctively moved with them, hovering close, her hand half reaching out, stopping herself just short of touching him. The memory of their desperate kiss in the storm-lashed hut, a confusing, searing brand in her mind amidst the overwhelming fear for his life. They lowered him onto a worn leather settle pulled close to the roaring hearth. He sank back with a gasp, his head lolling against the high back, eyes closed, his face etched with pain and profound weariness, the lines around his mouth deep and stark in the firelight. His coat had been removed, revealing the full horror of the wound on his linen shirt, a ragged tear high on the bicep, the fabric soaked through and sticking to the angry, swollen flesh beneath. A stout, gray-haired woman, Mrs. Bellamy, bustled in with an armful of clean linen in a steaming basin, her face set in lines of grim competence. Henderson stood over Thorne, his expression stern but not unkind. Right, Captain. Let's see the damage. Bellamy's the best field surgeon this side of York, saved my hide more than once after a poacher's shot. He began carefully cutting away the blood-soaked sleeve of Thorne's shirt with a pair of heavy shears. Eleanor watched, her stomach churning, as the wound was exposed, an ugly, deep furrow torn through the muscle, the edges ragged and inflamed, still oozing dark blood. The raw violence of it, the sheer physical destruction, was horrifying. Mrs. Bellamy muttered, cleaning the area swiftly but gently with hot water, her movements economical and sure. Thorne flinched, his jaw tightening, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the fire's heat. His eyes opened, glazed with pain, finding Eleanor's where she stood frozen a few feet away. A flicker of something, reassurance, apology, passed through them before they squeezed shut again as Mrs. Bellamy probed gently. Clean through, thank the Lord, the housekeeper pronounced after a tense moment. Missed the bone by a whisker, but tore the muscle proper. Needs stitching tight, Captain, and hot poultices to draw out the poison brewing. Grit your teeth, this'll bite. She poured a generous measure of brandy from a decanter Henderson handed her. Drink deep, sir. This is the bite before the bite. Thorne took the glass with his good hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and downed the amber liquid in one swift, harsh gulp, coughing as it burned its way down. He nodded tightly, bracing himself as Mrs. Bellamy threaded a needle with strong silk thread. Eleanor couldn't watch. She turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth, focusing on the dancing flames, the crackle of the logs, the rhythmic drumming of the rain still lashing the windows, anything but the muffled sounds of pain from the settle and the soft, wet snick of the needle-piercing flesh. Henderson guided her gently but firmly to a high-backed chair near the fire, pressing a glass of brandy into her own shaking hands. Drink, Lady Eleanor. You're safe now. Shock is a cruel companion. The brandy burned, but its heat spread through her chest, offering a fragile anchor. She sipped, her gaze inevitably drawn back to Thorne. He was enduring the stitching with a stoic silence that was somehow more terrible than cries would have been, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of the settle, his breathing harsh and controlled, sweat pouring down his temples. Mrs. Bellamy worked swiftly, her hands steady, her face expressionless. The tension in the room was thick, broken only by the fire's crackle and the occasional low murmur from Henderson as he watched. Finally, it was done. Mrs. Bellamy tied off the last stitch, applied a pungent-smelling poultice, and bound the wound tightly with clean linen strips. Thorne sagged back, utterly spent, his face gray, his eyes closed, breathing deeply as if surfacing from deep water. He needs rest, magistrate, Mrs. Bellamy stated, wiping her hands on her apron. A lot of it. And no moving that arm. Fever's likely, given the filth and the chill. Henderson nodded. See him settled in the blue room, Bellamy. Williams, help her. And post a guard outside the door. We don't know if those devils are bold enough to try anything here, but we're not taking chances. As Thorne was carefully helped to his feet and guided, half supported, from the room, his eyes opened briefly, seeking Eleanor again. The intensity was dulled by pain and exhaustion, but the connection was still there, a silent acknowledgement of the shared ordeal, the unresolved tension, the ledger's deadly secret now held by the magistrate. He gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod before disappearing through the doorway. Henderson turned his full attention to Eleanor. He pulled up a sturdy wooden chair and sat facing her, his expression grave. "Now, Lady Eleanor, while the captain rests, you must tell me everything. From the beginning. Who are these men? Why attack Blackwood? What is this stolen property Captain Thorne mentioned? And what," he leaned forward slightly, his keen eyes sharp, "is Captain Thorne's true stake in this?" The directness of his questions, the safety of the lodge, the warmth, the brandy, it all combined to shatter the last of Eleanor's fragile composure. The story poured out in a trembling, disjointed torrent, the stifling boredom shattered by Thorne's arrival, the shocking news of Julian's survival and debts, the ominous warnings of danger, the gunshot, the desperate flight through secret passages and the freezing tower, the discovery of Julian's damning note, the terrifying intimacy of hiding in the crypt, the frantic escape across the gardens, the ledger buried under the yew tree, the ambush at the pet cemetery, Thorne taking the bullet meant for her, the kiss in the storm-lashed hut charged with terror and desperate longing, the relentless pursuit by hounds, and their final, stumbling flight to the militia. She told him of Julian's warning, "Don't trust Thorne," and Thorne's harsh counter-accusation of Julian's cowardice and betrayal. She described the ledger, the names within, Thorne's grim pronouncement of its power to hang powerful men. Throughout, Henderson listened silently, his face impassive, absorbing every detail, only his eyes occasionally narrowing or flickering with sharp intelligence. When she finished, trembling and drained, he sat back, steepling his fingers, his gaze fixed on the fire for a long moment. The only sounds were the crackling logs and the drumming rain. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Julian Street. Claire, alive, and entangled in affairs far darker than mere gambling dens." He sighed, a weary sound. "I had heard whispers, Lady Eleanor. Rumors of debts owed to men who operate from the shadows, men like Silas Crowe, a name known even to the magistrates in London as a broker of violence for the highest bidder. But to have him operating here, in Yorkshire, brazen enough to attack Blackwood Manor," he shook his head, his expression grim. "Captain Thorne's story holds weight. His military record is known, if not spotless. A man who served with distinction, but also one who walked the edge." He met her eyes. "And this ledger, you say he gave it to me?" Eleanor nodded mutely. "It's inside his waistcoat, sir. He secured it just before we were ambushed." Henderson stood abruptly. "Then it is the key. And the greatest danger. Excuse me, Lady Eleanor. Mrs. Bellamy will see you to a room, get you dry clothes, something hot to eat. Rest. You are safe here." He strode from the room with purpose. Eleanor was left alone by the fire, the brandy glass cold in her hands. Safe. The word felt hollow. Thorne was wounded, perhaps gravely. Julian was God knew where, branded a traitor and a coward. Silas Crowe and his men were still out there, thwarted but undoubtedly furious. And the ledger, Henderson possessed it now. Names powerful enough to hang men. Names that would want that ledger destroyed. She thought of Thorne's face as they stitched him, the raw pain, the stoicism, the brief, unguarded look he'd given her. She thought of his body shielding hers in the tower, hauling her from the ditch, the desperate strength in his grip as they fled the hounds. She thought of the kiss, fierce, claiming, born of terror and an undeniable, terrifying hunger. "Don't trust Thorne." Julian's frantic warning echoed, but it was drowned out by the memory of Thorne's blood soaking his sleeve, shed protecting her, and the stark reality he'd voiced, he hadn't needed her to find the ledger. He could have taken it and vanished. Yet he hadn't. He'd brought her to safety. Exhaustion crashed over her like a wave, deeper than before. Mrs. Bellamy appeared, her face kind but firm. "Come along, my lady. Let's get you out of those wet things. You'll catch your death." Numbly, Eleanor allowed herself to be led away, up a narrow staircase to a small, clean bedchamber where a fire had already been lit. As Mrs. Bellamy helped her peel off the ruined silk and wrapped her in a thick, borrowed woolen robe, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window. The storm still raged, the wind howling around the eaves, the rain lashing the panes. Somewhere out there, danger still prowled. And in the room down the hall, Captain Marcus Thorne lay wounded, the man who might be her betrayer or her only hope, the unsettling, undeniable current between them a silent storm all its own. crackling beneath the fragile roof of the magistrate's lodge as the night wore on and the consequences of the ledger's revelation loomed like thunderheads on the horizon. Sleep felt impossible, a distant luxury reserved for a world that no longer existed. The borrowed wool robe scratched Eleanor's skin, a coarse, unfamiliar sensation after the ruined silk, yet its thick warmth was a profound relief, a small anchor against the profound chill that seemed to emanate from her core. Mrs. Bellamy had been briskly kind, plying her with hot, sweet tea and thick slices of buttered bread before leaving her alone in the small, fire-lit bedchamber with stern instructions to rest. Rest, however, was a phantom. The rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof tiles seemed to echo the frantic pounding of her heart against her ribs, each gust of wind rattling the windowpanes like Silas Crow's men testing the lodge's defenses. Eleanor paced the small space, the rough floorboards cool beneath her bare feet. Images flashed behind her closed eyelids, Thorne's blood spreading dark on his sleeve, the raw agony on his face as the needle bit into his flesh, the terrifying intimacy of their kiss in the hut, a desperate collision born of shared peril that now felt like a dream, or a fevered delusion. "Don't trust Thorne." Julian's frantic scrawl burned in her memory, a stark counterpoint to the undeniable reality of Thorne's wound, taken shielding her. Which brother lied? Which one betrayed? The weight of the question pressed down, suffocating. Unable to bear the confines of the room any longer, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, Eleanor quietly opened the door. The corridor outside was dim, lit only by a single guttering candle on a small table. A militiaman, Williams, she recalled, stood stiffly outside a door further down, rifle held ready. Thorne's room. Henderson's guard. For his protection, or hers. The suspicion, cold and insidious, coiled tighter in her gut. She moved silently down the corridor, her robe whispering against the wood. Williams glanced at her, his expression impassive but watchful. "Lady Eleanor. Magistrate said you should rest." I need to see him," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Just for a moment. To know he's alive. To see if his eyes hold truth or treachery." Williams hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Be quick, milady. He's sleeping, Mrs. Bellamy reckons. Lost a lot of blood." Eleanor slipped past him and gently pushed open the door. The air inside was warm, thick with the pungent scent of the poultice Mrs. Bellamy had applied, herbs, camphor, and something vaguely cloying. A single candle burned on a bedside table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Thorne lay on his back in the narrow bed, stripped to the waist, his powerful torso pale against the rough linen sheets save for the stark white bandages swathing his right shoulder and upper arm, already showing faint pink stains. His face, turned slightly towards the door, was etched with lines of pain even in unconsciousness, the stubble dark against his pallor, his brow furrowed, lips slightly parted as he breathed shallowly. He looked devastatingly vulnerable, a stark contrast to the hard-edged soldier who had dominated her drawing room or pulled her through the crypt. Eleanor approached the bedside, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stood looking down at him, the conflicting currents within her crashing violently. The suspicion, fueled by Julian's warning and the sheer, terrifying power of the names in the ledger, warred with the visceral memory of his body shielding hers, the raw courage in his eyes as he faced down Silas's men, the fierce, undeniable heat of his kiss. His hand lay atop the blanket, large, calloused, the knuckles scraped. She found her own hand reaching out, trembling, drawn by an impulse she couldn't control, hovering inches above his. She wanted to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin, to somehow bridge the chasm of doubt and danger that lay between them. Before her fingers could make contact, his eyes snapped open. Not drowsy, not confused, but instantly alert, sharp blue chips locking onto hers with startling intensity in the dim light. There was no vulnerability in that gaze now, only a fierce, probing awareness that pinned her in place. Her breath caught, her hand freezing midair. "Lady Eleanor," he rasped, his voice rough with sleep and pain, but devoid of weakness. "Couldn't sleep." His gaze flickered down to her hovering hand, then back to her face, a ghost of something unreadable, amusement. Challenge, flickering in his eyes. She snatched her hand back, clasping it tightly with the other, heat flooding her cheeks. I wanted to see how you fared," she managed, her voice unsteady. "Mrs. Bellamy said, the fever. Still fighting it," he said, shifting slightly, a grimace tightening his features. Hurts like the devil. But I've had worse. His gaze never left hers, intense, assessing. Henderson has the ledger. Eleanor nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Yes. He took it. He said it was the key. And the greatest danger. She hesitated, the question burning on her tongue, the suspicion clawing its way out. Captain Thorne. Julian's note. He said not to trust you. That you played him. She forced herself to hold his gaze, searching for a flicker of guilt, a telltale shift. Why should I believe you over my own brother? A harsh sound, almost a laugh, escaped him, quickly stifled by pain. He winced, closing his eyes for a second before reopening them, the blue depths hard as flint. Your brother, Lady Eleanor, he stated, his voice low and cold, is a desperate fool who stole a viper's nest and then, when the vipers stirred, panicked and threw his own sister into the pit to distract them while he ran. He knew Silas would come for leverage. He knew Blackwood, and you, would be targets. His warning. Thorne's lip curled in contempt. It wasn't to protect you. It was to discredit me, the one man who might actually stand between you and Silas's knives, in case I found you first. To buy himself more time to vanish into whatever rat hole he's found. The brutal logic, delivered with such cold conviction, struck her like a physical blow. It rang horribly true with the Julian she knew, charming, reckless, selfish. The Julian who would swear eternal secrecy about the tower compartment one moment and boast about it to his friends the next. The Julian who gambled away fortunes without a thought for the consequences to others. And you, she whispered, the fight draining out of her voice, replaced by a weary confusion. Why intervene? Why risk this? She gestured towards his bandaged arm. If it was just a debt to Julian, surely saving his life once was enough. Why involve yourself in this nightmare? Thorne held her gaze, the intensity in his eyes shifting, softening infinitesimally, revealing a depth of weariness and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like reluctant honesty. Because, he said slowly, the roughness in his voice deepening, when I saw Silas's shadow fall over Blackwood, when I realized who his leverage would be, it wasn't just about squaring a debt with Julian anymore. He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the bandages before returning to hers. It became about preventing an innocent woman from being butchered because of her worthless brother's greed and cowardice. The word innocent hung in the air between them. It felt like an absolution she hadn't known she craved. Tears pricked unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, hot and shaming. She looked away, towards the rain-lashed window, unable to bear the directness of his gaze any longer. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things, the shared terror, the kiss, the ledger's deadly secret, the fragile, terrifying connection that seemed to hum in the space between them despite the pain and suspicion. Silas won't stop, Thorne said finally, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the quiet room. He can't. That ledger names men who will kill without a second thought to keep their secrets buried. Henderson having it makes him a target too. He shifted again, trying to push himself up slightly on the pillows, his face tightening with the effort. We need a plan. We need. A sharp knock cut him off. The door opened, revealing Magistrate Henderson, his face grim in the candlelight, the oilskin packet containing the ledger held loosely in his hand. His expression was thunderous, all traces of his earlier professional calm gone, replaced by a cold, simmering fury. Captain Thorne, Henderson said, his voice dangerously quiet, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. Lady Eleanor, we need to talk. Now. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door firmly behind him, his eyes fixed on Thorne with an intensity that bordered on accusation. He held up the oilskin packet. I've examined the contents. Names, dates, transactions that would indeed topple men of significant standing. He took a step closer to the bed, his gaze boring into Thorne's. Including one name, Captain, that raises rather pointed questions about your own involvement in this sordid affair. A name linked to your last posting before you sold your commission. Care to explain why the name, Sir Alistair Vance, appears multiple times in this ledger, alongside notations for security procurement, and payments routed through channels known to be favored by freelance intelligence operatives like yourself? The air in the small bedchamber turned to ice. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat, her gaze snapping from Henderson's furious face to Thorne's. The captain's expression had shut down completely, becoming an unreadable mask, but she saw the minute tightening around his eyes, the sudden rigidity in his jaw. The flickering candlelight seemed to deepen the shadows around him, transforming him back into the dangerous, enigmatic stranger who had first invaded her stifling drawing room. Julian's warning, "Don't trust Thorn," echoed with horrifying new force, crashing over her alongside the magistrate's damning revelation as the storm raged against the windows, the fragile sanctuary of the lodge suddenly feeling like the most dangerous trap of all. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex, and far more perilous, than she had ever imagined. The name, Sir Alistair Vance, hung in the thick, medicinal-scented air of the small bedchamber like a physical blow, its impact silencing even the storm's fury outside the rattling window panes. Magistrate Henderson's accusation, delivered with cold, furious precision, slammed into Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, shattering the fragile, nascent trust she'd tentatively extended to Thorn only moments before. The flickering candlelight seemed to deepen the shadows around the captain's face, hardening the lines of pain into something far more dangerous, the vulnerability she'd glimpsed vanishing beneath an impenetrable, icy mask. Julian's frantic warning, "Don't trust Thorn," echoed with horrifying, vindicated clarity, crashing over her alongside Henderson's damning revelation, turning the warm sanctuary of the lodge into a claustrophobic cage of betrayal. Thorn didn't flinch, didn't look away from Henderson's accusing stare, his blue eyes chips of frozen sky reflecting the candle flame but revealing nothing, his bandaged chest barely rising with each shallow breath. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken peril, broken only by the drumming rain and Eleanor's own frantic heartbeat thundering in her ears. Henderson took another step closer to the bed, the oilskin packet containing the ledger held like a poisonous artifact. "Well, Captain," he pressed, his voice low and lethal. "Your silence is damning. Vance, your former commander, your patron, some said. Payments routed through known intelligence channels. Security procurement, a tidy euphemism for selling secrets, wouldn't you say? Was this your game all along? Use the feckless Julian Street. Claire is your cat's paw to steal the ledger, then swoop in to rescue his sister, playing the hero while securing the very evidence that could implicate you and your master." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, the borrowed wool robe suddenly scratchy and suffocating. She stared at Thorn, willing him to deny it, to offer some explanation, anything to shatter this horrifying picture Henderson painted. But Thorn remained terrifyingly still, his gaze locked with the magistrate's, the only movement the faint clenching of his jaw muscle. "Is it true?" Eleanor whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. Were you working with Vance? Using Julian? Using me?" Thorn finally moved, a slow, deliberate tilt of his head towards her. The intensity in his eyes hadn't lessened, but it held a different quality now, not defiance, not guilt, but a profound, weary resignation, laced with something that looked perilously close to regret. "Vance was my commander," he acknowledged, his voice a low, rough rasp devoid of inflection. "He is named in that ledger. The payments, the channels, they are consistent with operations I ran under his orders. Security procurement, covered a multitude of sins in the shadows after the war ended, magistrate. Information bought, threats neutralized, inconvenient truths buried. Vance moved in those circles. He profited from them." Henderson's face darkened further. "Profited? Or orchestrated? And where do you stand in this web, Thorn? Soldier following orders? Or willing accomplice?" Thorn's gaze flickered back to Henderson, a spark of his old fire igniting briefly. "I followed orders I believed served the Crown's interests, blurred as those lines often became in the mire Vance operated in. But I never stole for personal gain. And I never used a pawn like Julian Street. Claire." He shifted painfully against the pillows, his face tightening. "When I discovered Julian had somehow gotten his hands on this ledger, a record not just of Vance's dealings, but of half the powerful vipers in London's underbelly, I knew it was a death sentence for him and anyone connected to him. Vance would want it silenced, yes. But so would every other name on those pages. Silas Crow is just one hired blade, the men who hired him are infinitely more dangerous." He fixed his piercing blue eyes on Eleanor again, the intensity almost physical. "My coming to Blackwood wasn't part of Vance's design, Lady Eleanor. It was an attempt to counter it. To prevent Silas, or whoever Vance might send next, from butchering you to get to Julian in the ledger. to retrieve it before it ignited a war that would consume innocence. Henderson snorted, a harsh, disbelieving sound. A convenient narrative, Captain. You expect me to believe you turned against your powerful patron out of altruism. Out of concern for a society lady you'd never met. Thorne held Eleanor's gaze, ignoring Henderson. I came because Julian, fool though he is, once took a bullet meant for me. And because, he hesitated, the first genuine crack in his controlled facade appearing, a flicker of raw emotion in his eyes that stole Eleanor's breath. Because when I saw the shadow falling over Blackwood, it became about more than a debt. It became about you. The admission hung in the air, stark and undeniable. It didn't erase Henderson's accusations, it didn't dissolve the connection to Vance, but it carried a weight of truth that resonated deep within Eleanor, cutting through the fear and suspicion, echoing the desperate heat of their kiss in the storm. Henderson looked between them, his stern expression unreadable, the fury momentarily banked by the raw tension crackling in the small room. He tapped the oilskin packet against his palm. Your personal motivations, Captain, however complex or secondary. This ledger is a lit fuse. Vance will know Silas failed by now. He'll send others. Cleaner operators. Men who won't leave witnesses or make noise storming a manor. They'll come here. For this. He gestured with the packet. And for anyone who's seen its contents. He looked pointedly at Eleanor, then back at Thorne. We cannot stay. This lodge isn't defensible against professionals. We need to move you both. Somewhere secure. Somewhere Vance's reach might not extend so easily. Thorne nodded grimly, pushing himself up further despite the obvious agony it caused, sweat beading on his forehead. Agreed. Where? My cousin, Henderson stated. Sir Edgar Denham. His estate, Thornfield Hall, is 30 miles north. Isolated. He maintains a small, well-trained private guard, veterans mostly. Discreet. Vance wouldn't expect you there. We leave at first light. Travel fast, with an armed escort. Thorne can't travel 30 miles like this. Eleanor protested, the thought of jolting him in a carriage over rough roads with that wound horrifying. The fever, he stays, he dies, Henderson cut her off bluntly. Or you both do when Vance's men come. The journey will be hard, but Mrs. Bellamy will dose him with enough laudanum to keep him quiet and still. We'll pad the carriage. It's the only chance. Thorne met Henderson's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them, soldiers assessing risk. Do it, Thorne gritted out. But Eleanor, he turned to her, his expression fierce despite the pallor and pain. Listen to Henderson. Do exactly as he says. Trust him. The implicit message was clear. Don't trust me, not yet, not fully, but trust him to get you to safety. The ambiguity, the lingering shadow of Vance, the raw vulnerability in his plea, twisted Eleanor's heart. Henderson moved towards the door. Rest while you can, Captain. Lady Eleanor, Mrs. Bellamy will prepare what you need. We leave before dawn. He left, closing the door firmly behind him, leaving Eleanor alone again with Thorne in the tense, candlelit silence. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within her. Fear of Vance's unseen assassins, dread of the arduous journey, the crushing weight of the ledger's secrets, and the unresolved, treacherous pull towards the wounded, dangerous man in the bed who might be her savior or her doom. Thorne sank back against the pillows, closing his eyes, his breathing ragged, the lines of pain etched deep once more. He didn't speak, but his uninjured hand lay atop the blanket, palm open, a silent, unasked question hanging in the charged air thick with betrayal, danger, and the undeniable, perilous connection forged in blood and storm that not even Sir Alistair Vance's shadow could fully extinguish as the darkest hours of the night crept towards a perilous dawn. The pre-dawn gloom was thick and suffocating, a cold, damp shroud clinging to the magistrate's lodge as Eleanor, bundled in borrowed practical woolens that scratched her skin yet offered blessed warmth, watched Mrs. Bellamy administer the potent draught of laudanum to Thorne. He swallowed it without protest, his face a mask of stoic resignation beneath the pallor and the dark circles bruising his eyes, the bandages stark white against the worn linen shirt he'd been helped into. The drug worked swiftly, his intense blue eyes clouded over, losing their sharp focus, his powerful frame sagging deeper into the makeshift litter Henderson's men had rigged from sturdy poles and blankets. Seeing him rendered so vulnerable, so dependent, sent a fresh wave of icy dread through Eleanor. Warring violently with the treacherous warmth his confession in the night had ignited, it became about you. The dangerous ambiguity of his connection to Vance, the ledger's deadly shadow, and Henderson's grim pronouncement of Thornfield Hall as their only hope coalesced into a knot of fear tightening in her chest as the small, heavily armed party prepared to move out. Henderson, his face etched with grim purpose, checked the priming of his own pistol before holstering it. "Stay close to the carriage, Lady Eleanor," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. "Williams and Carter will ride flank. If anything happens, you get low and stay down." "Understood." She nodded mutely, her throat too tight for words, her gaze fixed on Thorne's slack form as 4 militiamen lifted the litter with practiced care, carrying him towards the waiting, enclosed carriage, a sturdy, unmarked vehicle drawn by 4 powerful bays, already stamping impatiently in the chill mist. The journey was a bone-jarring, nightmare blur. Even padded as best they could manage, every rut, every stone on the rough northern road sent shocks through the carriage, jolting Thorne into low groans of pain despite the laudanum's haze. Eleanor sat rigidly opposite him, her knuckles white where she gripped the leather strap, her heart lurching with every gasp that escaped his lips. The landscape outside the rain-streaked windows was a desolate tapestry of windswept moors and skeletal woods, gray and forbidding under the leaden sky, mirroring the desolation within her. Time lost meaning, measured only in Thorne's ragged breaths and the rhythmic clop of hooves. They stopped only briefly to rest the horses, the militiamen vigilant, scanning the empty horizons with hard eyes, rifles ready. Eleanor forced down tasteless oatcakes and sips of lukewarm tea, her stomach churning with anxiety. Thorne drifted in and out of consciousness, his eyes fluttering open occasionally, unfocused and clouded, sometimes murmuring disjointed phrases, Spanish words, battlefield commands, once, chillingly, Vance knows. Each time, Eleanor leaned closer, her hand hovering, wanting to offer comfort, held back by the lingering specter of betrayal and Henderson's watchful presence whenever he checked on them. As the bleak afternoon wore on, the moors began to give way to denser, ancient woodland. The road narrowed, winding between towering oaks and elms whose bare branches clawed at the gray sky like skeletal fingers. A deeper chill settled, and the first flakes of a new, icy snowfall began to drift down, dusting the dark evergreens. They were perhaps 10 miles from Thornfield, according to Henderson's terse update during the last stop, the isolation pressing in. Thorne's fever seemed to spike, he grew restless, his brow slick with sweat despite the cold, his breathing harsher. Eleanor dampened a cloth with precious water from a skin, reaching across the small space to gently wipe his forehead. His hand shot out with surprising speed, weak but desperate, closing over her wrist. His eyes opened, clearer than they'd been for hours, burning with a feverish intensity that locked onto hers. "Eleanor," he rasped, her name a raw scrape in the confined space. "The ledger. Henderson, trust only." A violent jolt rocked the carriage, throwing Eleanor sideways. A thunderous crack split the air, followed instantly by the panicked screams of horses and the sharp, deadly whine of a musket ball punching through the carriage wall mere inches above Thorne's head, splintering the wood. Ambush. Chaos erupted. Shouts from the militiamen outside, the sharp crack of return pistol fire, the terrified neighing of the horses as the carriage slewed violently. Another shot shattered the window beside Eleanor, showering her with glass. She screamed, throwing herself instinctively towards Thorne, covering his body as best she could as the carriage lurched again, tilting dangerously. Henderson's bellow cut through the din from outside. Ambush. Defensive positions. Protect the carriage. The carriage shuddered to a halt, canted at an angle. Through the shattered window, Eleanor glimpsed dark figures moving swiftly among the trees, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the gloom. Williams, crouched behind a wheel, fired his rifle, the report deafening. A cry of pain sounded from the woods. Then Carter, near the lead horses, went down clutching his leg, red blossoming on his breeches. "They're flanking us," Henderson roared, firing his pistol towards the trees on the left. "Too many. Fall back to the riverbank. Use the carriage for cover. Move." The surviving militiamen scrambled, dragging the wounded Carter, firing desperately as they retreated towards the sound of rushing water. Eleanor could now hear clearly over the gunfire and shouts. The carriage door was wrenched open. Henderson's face, grim and streaked with soot, appeared. "Out. Now. To the river." He reached in, hauling Eleanor bodily from the carriage. She stumbled into the chaotic scene, snow swirling, men shouting, gunsmoke acrid in the cold air. "Thorne." She turned back, but Henderson was already barking orders to 2 men. "Get the captain. Quickly. Go." The men plunged into the carriage. Eleanor stumbled after Henderson towards the steep, brush-choked bank overlooking a wide, fast-flowing river, its dark water churning ominously with ice floes. Bullets kicked up dirt around them. One of the militiamen carrying Thorne's litter cried out. Stumbling, Thorne's limp form nearly tumbled into the mud before the other man caught him. Henderson returned fire, his aim steady despite the chaos. Down the bank. Get to the water. They half slid, half fell down the slippery incline, crashing through frozen bracken. The icy spray from the river hit Eleanor's face like a slap. The militiamen lowered Thorne's litter onto the narrow, rocky shore. Only 4 men remained standing besides Henderson, including the wounded Carter, leaning heavily on Williams. Their attackers, perhaps 6 or 7 shadowy figures, were descending the bank now, more cautiously, using the trees for cover, their fire relentless. They were methodical, professional. Vance's men were pinned. Williams yelled, reloading frantically. "No cover here." Henderson scanned the river, then the opposite bank, perhaps 50 yards of treacherous, icy water away. It was steep, wooded. Sanctuary. Or drowning. Another volley of shots peppered the rocks near them. One struck the litter frame near Thorne's head. Henderson made a decision, his face set in lines of granite. "The river. It's the only way. Williams, take Lady Eleanor. Carter, Jenkins, with me on the captain." "The current, sir. The ice." "He'll never," Williams protested. "Do it," Henderson roared, firing towards the approaching figures. "Go. Now." He turned to the men at Thorne's litter. "Get him in. Support his head. Kick, damn you." Eleanor felt Williams's strong hand clamp onto her arm. "Come on, milady. No time." Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. The water looked black, deadly, swirling with chunks of ice. "Thorne!" she screamed, pulling against Williams. Henderson was already waist-deep, helping the men maneuver the heavy litter carrying Thorne's unconscious form into the freezing torrent. The current grabbed it instantly, threatening to tear it from their grasp. "Go, Eleanor!" Henderson bellowed, his voice raw, turning back to help his men wrestle the litter against the pull. A shot rang out, sharp and final. Henderson jerked violently, a look of profound surprise flashing across his face before he crumpled forward into the churning water, a dark stain spreading across the back of his coat. "Henderson!" Jenkins screamed. The magistrate's body was swept instantly into the current, vanishing beneath the dark, icy water. Panic seized the remaining men. The litter bucked, Thorne's limp body threatening to slide off into